Our story begins with a person running, and it was none other than our protagonist who declared that he was late. At that moment, two people noticed that our protagonist had arrived. Kim Do-won immediately started complaining about the delay. However, Kim Jimin pointed out that he was also often late. After arriving, the protagonist apologized for being late. And here are some details about our protagonist. He is a rank D support and his name is Shin Junseo. Continuing, Kim Do-won stated that he was just joking, while Kim Jimin explained that Chunwoo and Do-yoon were already inside. However, our protagonist admitted that things were not looking good. It had been 3 months since he joined that guild, and on his very first dungeon raid, he was already late. As they approached the portal, our protagonist thought that he should pull himself together, as this was his first dungeon raid as a support. Moreover, he felt the need to prove that he was useful. At that moment, someone arrived. It was none other than Moon Do-yoon, who asked if this was his first dungeon. The protagonist confirmed, explaining that it was his first time as a support. However, he had previously been in a dungeon as an assistant. Moon Do-yoon then explained that supports do not have combat skills like hunters, so he needed to be careful. Additionally, there was a risk of getting dragged into the fight if he got too close. If he stayed too far, they wouldn't be able to defend him, so maintaining a good distance was essential. He clarified that, as a creator, he only needed to stay at a safe distance and craft a dagger for him when signaled. Then, Moon Do-yoon asked if he had understood what the protagonist had said. In response, the protagonist asked if that was all he needed to do, to which Moon Do-yoon agreed, as he was the only one who required extra weapons. He explained that it was an easy dungeon, so there was no need to overburden himself. However, Lee Hyun-woo stated that he could sense mana, meaning there was a monster nearby. At that moment, their group started preparing for battle, following their formation. Moon Do-yoon asked Lee if he had any observations, and he reported detecting 3 small mana sources and 1 large one, big enough to be a boss. Hearing this, Moon Do-yoon found it strange, as a boss usually does not lead its designated area. He then declared that he would take on the boss while the others dealt with the rest. Then Moon Do-yoon asked how long it would take to create a dagger, and the protagonist responded that it would take 20 seconds but would only last for less than a minute. However, Moon Do-yoon found that ideal and instructed the protagonist to start making them immediately, declaring that he would finish the fight in 40 seconds. At that moment, crystal lizards appeared, classified as rank D in difficulty. Kim Do-won declared that he was starting. Activating his ability, he sent the lizards flying. Kim Jimin rushed forward, prepared her fist, and punched a lizard. After landing the hit, she swiftly moved away, striking a stylish pose. However, the other crystal lizards advanced. Kim Jimin was surprised to see how quickly they regenerated and warned everyone to be careful, as 2 were heading in her direction. Kim Do-won then asked about the spell, and Lee confirmed that it was almost ready. A moment later, Lee launched his spell, firing multiple fireballs that caused a massive explosion. Lee confirmed that everything was fine, and Kim Do-won then instructed them to assist. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed everything and remarked that it was an excellent sequence of attacks. However, Moon Do-yoon asked about the weapons. The protagonist confirmed that they were almost ready, reminding himself not to get distracted and to focus. After a short while, our protagonist used his basic creator ability, an F-rank creation, utilizing mana to forge objects. At that moment, the protagonist threw a sword to Moon Do-yoon. He quickly caught it and used his A-rank shadow weapon ability to enhance it, improving its overall quality. Meanwhile, the crystal lizard lunged at him. He effortlessly decapitated the monster. Following that attack, the protagonist's creation disappeared. Kim Do-won asked if anyone was injured, and Kim Jimin confirmed that she was fine. Witnessing all of this, the protagonist admitted that they were a much better guild than he had expected. Moreover, each of them was remarkable. Their teamwork prevented any mistakes in battle. He concluded that if they kept this up, they would become a great guild. However, on the other side, there was him. He declared that he had done nothing except create the dagger. Other than that, he was not very useful. He even questioned whether he deserved to be with them. But then, Moon Do-yoon approached him and asked if the protagonist was hurt. He declared that he was not. However, the protagonist explained that he had not been truly useful. Nonetheless, Moon Do-yoon declared that he would save a lot of money thanks to his ability. As he had seen earlier, his ability consumed weapons. Moreover, he could not keep doing that even if he used a cheap dagger. That was why he needed a creator like the protagonist, as his ability worked on any weapon that contained mana. Then he declared once again that he had done well in his first dungeon mission. He told him to keep going and not to run away from them, to which he responded that he would do his best. At that moment, Kim Do-won declared that they should collect the loot and leave. However, the entire environment trembled. Kim Jimin even wondered if an earthquake was happening, and Lee asked if the cave was collapsing because they had killed the boss. But pointing his finger, the protagonist asked them to look over there. He explained that the wall was crumbling. However, Lee cast a spell on his staff. He explained that there was something similar to a passage and declared that it must be connected to somewhere. While Moon Do-yeon thought about it, Kim Do-won could not stay still and declared that it was a secret passage. Furthermore, he explained that there was probably a hidden treasure and urged them to go. Kim Jimin also agreed with this. However, Lee declared that they could not go inside. But then Moon Do-yeon asked if Lee could detect anything, to which he replied that he could not. With that, Moon Do-yeon saw no problem and asked them to be quick. Seeing the situation, Lee agreed to go as well. Then Moon Do-yeon called for our protagonist. However, a moment after entering, our protagonist was running from a monster. Our protagonist explained that everyone was dead except for him. He explained that such a monster should not be in a D-ranked dungeon. Moreover, he had never heard of a monster that could not be detected by magic. Turning back, the protagonist realized that the monster had caught up to him. Then the monster punched him, sending him flying. He hit the ground, coughing up blood. The protagonist declared that he needed to get up, because he could not die that way. So he conjured something. He created a dagger and threw it at the monster. However, it had no effect, and the monster attacked fiercely. It shattered the ground, causing him to fall. As he fell, the protagonist grew anxious about the situation. He declared that he was a useless D-rank support, unable to use even simple things like healing or buff skills. Moreover, when he had finally found a guild that actually needed him, he abandoned them only to be killed all the same. He explained that anyone in his place would have done better. At that moment, he declared that he should never have awakened. However, the system notified him that he had found something, but it was censored. Moreover, he had met the requirements to become a player. When he opened his eyes, a strong light appeared. Thus, the system welcomed him. After a while, our protagonist opened his eyes, and the system declared that there was a new reward for him. However, our protagonist understood nothing. Even though he did not understand what was happening, he opened his hand, and so he clicked the system's button. Sometime later, our protagonist returned to the place where he had fallen. The system informed him that he would inherit the experience from his previous save. Meanwhile, the crystal golem roared. However, the system announced that the reward distribution was complete. Then our protagonist launched several swords at the monster, which consequently collapsed to the ground. On the other side, our protagonist was deep in thought, as unknown memories had been placed in his head. But with no time to think much, the monster advanced at him once again. At the last second, our protagonist managed to conjure some kind of barrier. The protagonist was surprised to see that the monster had taken no damage. Despite being a golem-type monster, it had formidable durability. After his barrier was destroyed, the protagonist declared that if the information from those memories was correct, even though the monster was a golem type, its weak points and the tactics to defeat it would still be the same. The supposed golem-type monster had no specific weak points. Even if it took damage, it had an ability that allowed it to regenerate. As this was the case, he would need to inflict damage on it from multiple angles at the same time. And since he was a skill-based user at his core, he needed to materialize a grid and a beam of equal distance. This was because creations made within the grid could move freely according to the user's will. Thus, our protagonist conjured multiple abilities and attacked the monster, which consequently suffered great damage. As the smoke cleared, the monster appeared completely destroyed. The protagonist stated that he initially saw the special grid as merely a support ability that helped his creations move faster. However, as the proficiency of the skill increased, it could also be used as an offensive ability. At that moment, the system notified that the boss had been defeated. However, both the boss's name and the dungeon's name were censored. This obviously surprised him, as he couldn't see any information about the monsters or the dungeon. Yet, in front of him, something seemed to be forming. The system then notified that the passive skill, Magic Absorption, had been activated. Looking at it, the protagonist questioned what it was. Then he began to reflect on what had just happened, memories from his previous game. Even though he didn't know exactly what it was, there was one thing he was sure of. It was definitely him, and to be more specific, it was him from a few years in the future. In that future, the entire world had collapsed. There were horrible things. Additionally, he had absorbed all the experiences and knowledge from that time, and even if it was the future, it probably wasn't the future of the world he was currently in. Besides, too many things were out of place for it to be happening now, just like the status window in front of him, which was something he had never been able to understand, even in his past life. Seeing all of this, the protagonist questioned whether he had finally become a player. The term player was used for those who were chosen and awakened, and according to him, at this time, players did not exist in this world. However, about 2 years ago, a small number of awakened individuals were selected to become players. With this, a blue screen appeared, visible only to those who were chosen. Yet in the future, a mysterious thing called the system, something that seemed like a joke, was enough to shock everyone. After all, the system wasn't the only thing given to the players. Each player received different things, such as strength and unique abilities. These two things simply appeared out of nowhere. However, players utilized them and experienced explosive growth compared to other awakened individuals. And thanks to the leader who was chosen as a player, The guild he was part of was able to develop and become a first-class guild. Even though he had no direct connection to it, he should remain confident, because he had honed his skills and worked harder and harder. He stated that he could now check the abilities he had learned through the system, even though he had always thought it was impractical. However, after thinking for a moment, he realized that he had never had an ability triggered by a dead golem. Moreover, he had never heard of it from any other player. It accumulated energy from contaminated mana. Thus, he declared that he now understood how to obtain that magic. However, he would think about it later, because for now his priority was to take care of his body. Scene changed to the Hunter Association headquarters. A woman asked if he was sure he had let him go, because it was strange that a small guild had been destroyed after entering an unconfirmed dungeon. Moreover, he was the only one to survive out of the 4 who had died. The man stated that he could have escaped. Additionally, he had taken care of the bodies and reported to the association. Also, the portal had disappeared, so they couldn't investigate further. However, the woman asked what he thought, as she still found everything strange. The man asked if she really thought a rank D had killed the hunters, and told her to wake up. After all, this wasn't a police case. He stated that even if something had happened, anything that happens inside a dungeon cannot be verified, so all they could do was gather evidence. The woman acknowledged that she knew that. Then, the man stated that they could have been one of those people. After all, several hunters had been disappearing after entering unreported portals, trying to make money and live secretly. Additionally, it was impossible for small guilds to win a bid for a portal. However, the man told her to call if there was any additional investigation and declared that he was leaving. As he walked out, the man looked at the file, stating that his name was Shin Junseo. He admitted that he hadn't told her the whole truth because this case felt different from the others. This situation gave him a strange feeling. First of all, he had remained calm the entire time. Moreover, he had no experience in dungeons and witnessed a tragedy. However, he wasn't panicking, and there were still some missing pieces in between. Obviously, it could be his personality. However, he had seen people like that before. Even though he knew something was off, he didn't know what it was. Nevertheless, it wasn't something he should worry about at the moment, and he affirmed that he would take a good look at it later. At another moment, we see our protagonist walking through the streets. While reflecting on what had happened, he declared that something felt strange. That dungeon didn't exist in the memories of his past life. Moreover, everyone had clearly seen the purchase license for the portal. It had the association stamp on it, but since it was registered as an unconfirmed portal by the association, someone must have impersonated them and deceived the Dawn Guild, or maybe the association itself could be involved. However, what worried him the most was that this didn't happen only to the Dawn Guild. After all, cases of missing people had already become a problem. Even though he didn't know the full story, all the guilds mentioned in the news had a common theme. They all included players like Moon Duyan and even prodigies who would become heroes in the future. He then declared that there might be someone trying to erase the existence of these heroes. In other words, what he needed to do now was hide his abilities. Moreover, he was the only survivor of a missing persons case, and if he did anything suspicious, he would be caught in the act. He had 2 years until the first player selection to prepare, so he needed to mobilize each of his abilities and develop them by then. However, he needed to find a way to grow without attracting too much attention. Looking at the system window, he noticed there was a usable ability. Pointing his finger at it, he affirmed that he had this one. A year later, somewhere in the forest in the middle of the mountains, the sounds of blows could be heard, and sparks were visible. The hunter struck with his sword, but the monster raised a shield in time, blocking the attack, which caused the man's blade to crack. Then it completely shattered, leaving him very nervous. After that, the monster attacked, throwing him backward, but he managed to land successfully and planted the broken sword into the ground to help himself stop. Then he looked at the monster. However, without giving him time, the monster charged at him, yet he managed to dodge. He landed near his teammates and let out a deep sigh as the enemy turned toward them and cast a fierce glare in their direction. This was the Null Lord, Danger Level D, a high-ranking Null with physical abilities superior to those of an ordinary Null. The hunter stood up and extended his trembling hand forward, questioning what it was doing in an E-rank dungeon. Moreover, even D-rank hunters had said that this monster was difficult to deal with. At that moment, the Null lunged forward to attack, but the man with the shield reacted in time, stepping up and blocking the attack with his shield. His hands trembled from the powerful impact, and he shouted that they wouldn't be able to hold out for long. However, no matter what, they had to at least cause some damage to it. Soon, the swordsman was horrified and explained that this was the Grim Reaper of low-rank hunters. But the Null didn't earn that title just because of its physical abilities. Since monsters of this level are vulnerable to magic, any hunting team relies on it. But this monster defied that logic. The hunters who relied on low-level magic felt fear for the first time. Despite that, the price of their foolishness and pride would usually be the annihilation of their group. They had only one physical damage dealer, but he was bad at close combat and his weapon was broken. Moreover, there were no weapons left, even though the tank had told him to attack. Shocked, he admitted that he had gathered the maximum number of people because of his pride. However, hiring people and a mage ended up screwing him over in this way. Yet the man noticed something. He saw a young man cutting magic stones with a pickaxe. Assistants don't participate in battle. They only collect resources like magic stones and are seen as handymen with no recognition or respect among the awakened. The hunter suddenly remembered that they had an assistant and thought they were about to die while he was just mining crystals. Suddenly, what he saw surprised him. The pickaxe in the assistant's hands simply vanished into thin air. He wondered if it was a creation ability, as it would be useful even without high quality, considering they could still use it. He called out to the assistant loudly, and the assistant turned around. It was Junseo. The man approached excitedly and asked if he was a creator and if he knew how to make swords. He confirmed this information. The man, showing his broken blade, asked him to make a sword, preferably a strong one. Junseo apologized and reminded him that he was an assistant, not a support. The swordsman trembled and said this was not the time for that, questioning if he didn't realize they were about to die, because if they couldn't handle the boss, he would die as well. With that, Junseo let out a deep sigh. Reluctantly agreeing to the request, he began crafting while stating he had a condition. After clearing the dungeon, they had to forget about his ability, and when dividing the loot, he would receive the same share as a support. He agreed to help if they accepted these terms. The man looked at the new weapon in his hand with surprise. He despised the mediocre quality of someone who had failed as a creator and was now an assistant, finding it ridiculous to think they could clear a dungeon with just a weapon. Junseo smiled and said it was funny. The weapons in the hands of others began to change, and he stated that a good weapon was a necessary element for clearing a dungeon. At that moment, our protagonist affirmed that he would guarantee something. As long as they had this element, they would be able to clear that dungeon. Sometime later, at the Overkill Guild, one of the 3 largest guilds in Korea, a girl named Min Hee-soo walked down the corridor and stopped in front of the enormous doors. She then knocked, and Yoon Tae-hyun, seated at the desk inside the room, allowed her to enter. She addressed him as guild master and informed him that the association had sent a cooperation request. He asked about the errors in dungeon levels, and she confirmed, explaining that it seemed like a standard cooperation request, but with payment as stated. Tae-hyun asked if they had a choice, because it was difficult to find another awakened individual capable of entering a forcibly closed gate. However, he noticed a familiar face. The system displayed news about an A-rank bug dungeon that had been successfully cleared, and he recognized a familiar face in the team photo. A bug-ranked dungeon had appeared in Showdown a few weeks ago. He had been sent to the area and was at the scene, and he had definitely seen him there. The data showed that he was an assistant, and although new dungeons appeared frequently, the chance of a bug occurring in them was still low, and the number of cases where there were survivors in bug dungeons could be counted on one hand. Yet this assistant had been part of a team that had survivors not just once, but twice, and he exclaimed that this couldn't be a coincidence. Hee-soo commented that it seemed like more and more bug dungeons were appearing lately. A D-ranked dungeon a few days ago had suddenly turned into a B-ranked dungeon, and the entire team had been instantly wiped out. The leader said that the Hunter Association must be facing a lot of problems. She added that many people were criticizing the association. After all, it was their responsibility to analyze, predict, and announce the dungeon levels. Tae-hyun closed his eyes and rubbed his chin in confusion, thinking that the guy from the association must be struggling a lot right now. He commented on the increasing number of people with the invasion ability and the need to pay extra commissions for a while to monitor the situation. However, Tae-hyun then asked about what he had requested her to look into. She responded that she had searched everywhere but couldn't find a single weaponsmith of A rank or higher. However, she had received a B rank weapon from a Japanese smith and asked if he wanted to test it, to which he replied that any weapon below A rank would be destroyed. He got up from his chair and began saying that many smiths were supports. He told her to keep looking, otherwise he would continue destroying all the weapons. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Someone entered the office, saying that something had happened. Tae-hyun stood up from his desk and walked toward him, asking what had happened. The person reported that it was an urgent message from the association, checking the location of a D-ranked dungeon where rookies had entered as a free attack team. Tae-hyun asked what the current level was, and he responded that it was now C rank. After hearing this, Tae-hyun sighed and said they couldn't afford to lose the rookies. Moreover, it seemed like an emergency, so he would go personally. Soon they arrived at the gate's location, where journalists were gathered. Noticing the presence of the Overkill Guild Master, they asked Tae-hyun to comment on the dungeon errors and questioned if he had come because members of his guild were part of the attack team. He ignored them, and the concerned girl who had been waiting thanked him for coming personally and asked about the situation. She explained that the attack team consisted of 6 hunters, 2 supports, and an assistant. However, the numbers didn't matter since the dungeon was now C rank. He asked how long they had been inside. She replied that it had been about 2 hours. After approaching the portal, he said that he didn't know how many of them were still alive, but he would do everything in his power. The woman gave a slight bow and thanked him. Then he looked at the gate and threw his case onto the ground. He extended his hand toward the secretary for her to hand him something. She reached into her bag, from which a bright light emerged, and pulled out a sword, as she was a B-rank support specialized in opening subspaces even in enclosed areas. After that, she handed the weapon to the guild master. At that moment, he delivered a strong strike against the gate. His invasion ability was activated, along with a small crack that appeared on the gate, growing larger within seconds. His ability to forcefully open a path was capable of breaking any barrier, including gates. However, when moving to another dimension, the ability only affected the user. After this strike, his sword broke, and he returned it to Hizu's hands, who asked him to be careful. He agreed and then decided to step through the crack in the gate. Inside the dungeon, he stopped immediately and looked around, noticing a change in temperature and increased humidity in the air. From the unpleasant smell, there had to be reptiles living there. The fact that the floor was clean indicated that it was a relatively intelligent monster. Considering the dungeon's level, the answer was quite obvious. Lizardmen were humanoid reptilian monsters of D rank that lived in tribal groups, possessing a lifespan proportional to their intelligence and combat strength. Thus, he proceeded to another room, thinking that he could deduce the group's size, combat strength, and assess the danger level as identified in the report. However, they might already be dead by now. As he advanced, he suddenly heard sounds of battle and voices, and he couldn't help but imagine the worst. But when he arrived at the location where the team was, he saw something unexpected. The monsters were attacking, but the hunters were blocking their strikes and counterattacking immediately, acting in perfect coordination as a team. A girl shot an arrow that pierced through one of the monsters, and Taehyun was surprised, wondering if they were actually winning. From the hunters' movements, the lizardmen were visibly stronger. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted, as he saw, in the next moment, one of the monsters knocking the weapon out of a hunter's hands. The man looked up in terror, realizing that he was about to receive a powerful strike. Taehyun rushed to help him, thinking that it wasn't too late yet. But then suddenly, the lizardman launched its attack. However, its strike was blocked by a sword that appeared out of nowhere, leaving it deeply surprised. The hunter's breath quickened with fear, while the guild master, who was running to assist him, stopped and thought that it might be magic. However, he quickly dismissed that idea upon realizing that it was a weapon created in midair. Still, he wanted to know who had made it. He turned and saw the assistant near the crystals, the one who had conjured that sword. Noticing Taehyun's gaze, Junseo turned his head slightly and their eyes met. He looked at the team members fighting against the monsters and began counting them. When he counted a total of 9 people, he shifted his gaze to Taehyun and pointed a finger at him, saying that he was the 10th. Taehyun explained that this was strange since he clearly remembered that only 9 had entered. The guild master frowned and asked what he was doing. At that moment, one of the team members blocked an attack, but the monster was stronger and sent him flying backward. The mage immediately rushed to help him, while the lizardman raised its sword above its head, preparing to strike. Seeing this, Taehyun grew concerned and immediately moved to attack, drawing his sword. Meanwhile, Junseo looked at his open case and thought that he hadn't expected Yoon Taehyun to come personally to assist them. He noticed that Taehyun had brought an extra weapon. The hot wind caused by Taehyun's strike brushed against his face. He covered his blade in flames and pressed harder against the opponent's sword, breaking through its defense, then ordered the hunters behind him to retreat. The mage helped his teammate up and thanked him for the assistance. After that, Taehyun disarmed his opponent. He reignited the flames and charged forward, delivering powerful strikes, and the monster's body was soon covered in numerous cuts, from which green blood gushed, until its corpse fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Taehyun explained that despite being a B-rank weapon, it still hadn't reached its full potential. He lifted his gaze and saw the lizardman charging toward him. The monster attacked, and Taehyun defended himself before leaping backward. He stopped beside Junseo, who called his name. He asked if this happened every time he used a skill, because it seemed very exhausting. The others rushed toward the monster, and the guild leader asked if he was asking for trouble. Suddenly, blue sparks appeared in front of his face, and a weapon was created from them. Junseo handed it to him, asking him to take it, and not to destroy his poor weapon. Taehyun looked at the sword in surprise because Junseo had materialized it with a single gesture. Taehyun stated that he was an extremely skilled weapon creator. He noticed the pickaxe in his hand and questioned if he was an assistant, recalling that low-rank supports sometimes entered dungeons in that role. But suddenly, the protagonist interrupted his thoughts. He took the broken sword from Taehyun's hand and said there was a condition. After clearing and leaving the dungeon, he had to forget about him and his abilities. Taehyun reached out for the new sword and asked if he really thought he could just forget because he wanted to. In response to his words, Junseo began to destroy the sword and said that if not, then he should just let him go and cut everyone down with his high-class weapon. The guild master sighed and thought that the weapon would break as soon as he used a skill on it, so having a few more wouldn't hurt. He took the sword and replied that he understood everything and also promised to forget about it. At that, Junseo smiled and affirmed that he could go. After that, the guild master rushed to attack and approached the enraged lizard man. Then he ignited the sword with a bright flame and struck, causing massive flames to erupt around them. The monster used more force to try to withstand his attack, but in the end, its sword broke. However, Taehyun thought he only wanted to counter the attack, but his opponent's weapon ended up breaking first. He looked at his blade and thought that his control was visibly better than usual and wondered if the weapon itself was strong. Then he looked at Junseo, who was collecting crystals at that moment, expressing surprise that he was capable of manifesting a weapon above B rank. At that moment, the monster decided to attack him with a broken weapon, raising its sword above its head to strike, and Taehyun prepared himself, thinking this was interesting. Wanting to see what the weapon was capable of, he stated that he would increase the power. With these thoughts, he plunged the tip into the monster's abdomen, causing the blade's flames to pierce through the monster's body and emerge in a bright flash. Without wasting time, the guild master pushed himself off the monster's shoulder and jumped behind it, then leaped upward and raised his sword above him, igniting it once more. He drove the blade into the monster's head, piercing it, making it scream loudly. Then blood gushed from its mouth, and its body collapsed to the ground. At that moment, Taehyun noticed that there wasn't a single scratch, so at least he needed that, but he was interrupted by someone calling him. It was people thanking Taehyun for his presence, as they only survived because of him. He walked up to them and said it seemed like no one was seriously injured, which made him happy. One of the men turned his attention to Junseo and said that with his weapon, they wouldn't have even been able to fight, but they endured thanks to him. The guild leader himself turned his gaze toward him, thinking about something. Then he approached and asked for his name. The protagonist questioned the reason for the question. He stated that they should know each other's names to call each other properly, introducing himself as Yoon Taehyun. While closing his backpack, Junseo turned to him, then stood up and approached, stating his name. Looking at the man behind him, he said he would lead the stone man at the entrance. The man agreed with a confused expression. As Junseo was about to leave, Taehyun stopped him and asked him to wait, offering to go with him to the boss room. He took the backpack from his hands, and Junseo stated that he was just an assistant. The guild leader handed the backpack to another man, explaining that a dungeon bug prevented them from exiting without defeating the boss, so he explained that he could take care of it. At that moment, Taehyun stated that no weapon was capable of fully withstanding his skill. However, breaking the weapons he had made for himself would be pointless. The protagonist replied with a hint of irritation that his weapon wouldn't break, to which Taehyun responded that he thought the same and explained that they were in a bugged dungeon. The creatures living there weren't ordinary lizard men, and if the boss was the same, then extra caution wouldn't hurt. Junseo sighed heavily. Deciding to agree, he threw the backpacks on the ground. As soon as he approached him, he asked if all he had to do was follow along. Soon, they found themselves in a large hall illuminated by torches. Frozen at the entrance, they saw a throne at the far end of the hall, where the C+ danger level lizard lord was seated. Taehyun explained that they should ignore the existing danger levels and any information about them. And with a smile, he stated that they would finish this as quickly as possible. Both activated their abilities, and Taehyun warned that the weapon could break apart, to which the protagonist replied that he had already ensured that wouldn't happen. Then, the Lizard King extended his hand toward them. He pointed the tip of his spear at them, ordering his lizards to charge and attack. As soon as the lizard men attacked, both jumped backward. Then, Taehyun propelled himself off the wall and surged forward. The Lizard Lord noticed this, and when he landed too close, the beast swung its claw. At that moment, he held his sword in front of him. Just then, the monster whipped its tail forward, sending a powerful gust of wind in his direction, forcing him to increase the distance between them. He then pushed off and ran again, but this time, the Lizard Lord was charging straight at him. Their blades collided with a loud crash, and both pulled back again. However, the Lord mounted his lizard man, which began to spew tongues of fire from its mouth. Then a powerful jet of fire shot toward the man. He wanted to block the attack with his sword, but Junseo created a shield in front of him just in time, protecting him from the intense blast. He himself stood off to the side, observing the fight. At that moment, the lizardman charged, throwing Taehyun backward. Landing beside Junseo, he asked if he wasn't just a weapon creator. The protagonist responded that a shield could also become a weapon. He ignited his sword with flames and smiled, saying that once they got out of there, he would have many questions for him. After those words, he ran toward his opponent, and the Lizard Lord swung his hand, launching a chain from his spear, which had a sharp tip. The chain struck the sword and coiled around the blade. Then, the Lizard Lord pulled his hand back, dragging the enemy toward him. Taehyun was pulled directly toward the open mouth of the lizard man. Seeing this, Junseo extended his hand forward and told him to stop messing around and fight. He deconstructed the weapon, and Taehyun, letting go of it, asked with a smile if he hadn't requested to test it. A new weapon appeared in his hand, and the exhausted protagonist told him to take care of his pet. After that, the chain weapon, which had not yet vanished, flew over the lizardman's head, and Taehyun delivered several slashes to its mouth. Seeing the blood splatter, the monster was startled. Then the man threw a sword at it, but the monster managed to dodge just in time. In the blink of an eye, Taehyun got very close and then kicked it with all his strength, sending it flying to the side. The lizard lord fell off the back of his lizardman, and at that moment, Taehyun soared high into the air, swinging his sword and igniting it once again. What the monster saw made it nervous. It had no time to react before receiving a powerful strike that severed its arm. Realizing it wouldn't be able to fight back, it turned its gaze toward Junseo, who had not participated in the battle. Grabbing its spear, it charged straight at him, but the protagonist was prepared for this, and just before the attack landed, he raised a shield in front of him, making the monster anxious. The protagonist then asked with displeasure who had thought it was to point a weapon at him. At that moment, Taehyun appeared behind the monster, engulfed in blazing flames. The lizard lord didn't know what to do. It was trapped from both sides. Meanwhile, the people outside continued to watch the gate. Seeing the color change to blue, they rejoiced as it meant the gate was opening. After that, the guild team emerged from the portal. The journalists immediately rushed to Taehyun, eager to know what was inside the dungeon and what had happened to the boss. The guards surrounded him, and Hizu asked if he was injured, to which he replied that he was fine. His guild members thanked him from behind for his help, with the girls saying that if not for him, they would already be dead. Meanwhile, Junseo handed the collected resources to the man and said that since he had already received his payment in advance, he needed to leave. The protagonist, giving one last glance at the team, simply departed. One of the journalists, in the meantime, approached the guild leader and asked how he had managed to clear the dungeon so quickly. He turned around and said that he wasn't alone there, but when he didn't see Junseo behind him, he froze. The man asked if he had done that while everyone was somehow blocking together with teamwork, which allowed him to handle all of them, and the warrior beside him said that their weapons had broken, and that if it weren't for the guild leader, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. Upon hearing this, Taehyun explained that it was thanks to those people who kept making weapons for them that they had lasted this long. The man responded that he was talking about the support who was there as an assistant. He was also a weapon creator. Still confused, the warrior stated that he knew someone had helped, a support, and then asked the girl if he had that ability, to which she said she wasn't sure. After hearing their answers, Taehyun turned to the rest of the team and asked if they hadn't seen him create weapons. They looked at the backpacks they had left behind, where the pickaxe should have been, and someone commented that he didn't even have one. Another team member replied that he did have a pickaxe but must have lost it. However, he had collected all the mana stones. Taehyun was confused and wondered what had happened. After all, he had created weapons for all of them, yet it seemed they had forgotten about it. He remembered how Junseo had asked him to forget everything about weapon creation, and he wondered in surprise if that was rental payment. However, he questioned how someone could use a skill exclusive to A-rank or higher creators. His friends called him, not understanding what was wrong. After that, he tossed the weapon case into his vice leader's hands and ran off to look for Junseo. He and his secretary watched him confused. He kept running and looking around, wondering where Junseo had gone, questioning if he had really disappeared. Suddenly, he stopped. Junseo was nearby, hiding behind a brick wall. Seeing that no one else was around, Taehyun realized he wouldn't be able to catch up to him. At that moment, his guild members ran up to him, asking what had happened. He turned to Hisu and said that he needed to find someone now. Then, a scene showed our protagonist leaving. Time passed, and soon, Hisu arrived at the guild leader with the news that she had determined Shin Junseo's location. He had entered a D-ranked dungeon near Songpeg around 1 p.m. with a group of 5 people. Taehyun then told her she had done a great job. However, Hisu questioned why he was interested in the protagonist. Taehyun looked at the tablet and asked if she really thought that way. He considered that, of course, Junseo was a D-rank creator, otherwise it would be hard to imagine. He reviewed his general information and thought that, according to all records, he was ranked D, but he had rental payment, and that skill refuted everything. Rental payment was an A-rank skill. The rental payment ability was incredibly powerful, and he stated that he had never seen anyone use it that way. Furthermore, Junseo was using it just to hide his real ability. A weapon creator like him could level up easily, but he would find out when he met him. At that moment, he felt something he had never felt before. He recalled the sensation of holding the sword Junseo had created, and he thought that he could fight with full strength without worrying about the weapon breaking. Despite having met many swordsmiths considered the best, but as soon as they presented their latest products, he would take them with hope and try using his skill on them. Even though those smiths were confident in their products, as soon as he delivered a powerful fire strike, he was immediately disappointed because all the weapons broke. In the end, the smiths who had been confident in their products ended up holding their heads in frustration as they watched their items be destroyed. None of the weapons met Taehyun's expectations, not to mention that the creation skill was limited to normal weapon types. But Junseo had created something that greatly surpassed that limitation of type and ability. It was as if there were no restrictions. With Junseo's skill, this was possible, something he hadn't used because he hadn't had the right weapon. The time required to clear a D-rank dungeon with 5 people was 4 hours, leaving just 1 hour remaining. He stood up and asked Hisu what was still on the schedule. She explained that he had a meeting with Guild Master Kenmu. However, he told her to cancel the meeting because he was leaving early. He wanted to make sure he didn't miss the opportunity. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the team was fighting against orcs. A warrior pierced them in the stomach, causing their death, and watched their corpse fall. He was soon surprised by the capability of that creation and questioned whether it was really something made by an assistant. If that amount of mana could destroy a boss's weapon, it had to be at least a C-rank ability, or maybe even higher. When the weapon shattered, he thought they were done for, but he never imagined that his assistant had such a skill. He picked up the sword and laughed loudly, saying it was simply impressive. He had never seen a sword of such high quality. He looked at Junseo and thanked him for his help. Then he asked the girl if he wasn't in any guild. Maybe they should recruit him into theirs. She replied that it would be a great idea, and she stated that she found it a bit shameful for him to be just an assistant. She asked if that was true, and he laughed in response, saying she had a sharp eye. Upon hearing the conversation, the protagonist realized that he had used more mana than he had imagined and thought about how much the team had struggled, even though it wasn't a failed dungeon. He walked to the place where mana stones grew and threw his backpack on the ground, thinking that if he had had more mana back then, everything would have been different. In that dungeon, he felt an incredible amount of mana like never before. After defeating the golem and using all his mana, it never reappeared. What he felt now was nothing more than the mana of a D-rank awakened, but he felt relieved knowing that there was no problem in creating weapons. He created a pickaxe and looked at it, thinking that who would have thought memories could be so useful. The basic ability of a creator is the creation of special items, whose quality depends on the amount of mana used, despite being a very intuitive skill. There is a way to increase the efficiency of the ability, but it remains unknown. This is the comprehension level. The higher the comprehension level of the created item, the better its quality. The strong point of the ability is that increasing quality improves mana efficiency, creating the same object but with variable quality depending on the level of understanding. He remembered how much he had trained when he learned about this hidden ability, studying the material, training support, and going to the workshop for weapon-making lessons. But he achieved more than he expected, so he began mining mana stones with his pickaxe, and he thought he didn't know how much better it was, but compared to the mana use, it seemed like more than just a slight increase. However, it still wasn't enough. It was difficult to use creation and payment at the same time. Equipment that affected mana was expensive, so there was no way to buy it now. At the very least, he could buy a mana potion, the only mass-produced item that affected mana. He needed to request some of those potions, but with an assistant's salary, it would still be difficult. However, no one would hire a D-rank support, so he had no choice. He opened the window displaying the passive mana absorption ability, and thought the result wasn't bad. It was reassuring. He was very close to reaching the 20% mana absorption goal. Clearing several dungeons wouldn't be enough. A protected dungeon yielded just over 1%, a very low efficiency. There was only one option left, to go to the bugged dungeon. That was the only way to absorb a large amount of mana at once. Compared to other dungeons, it absorbed several times more mana. He explained that before he could enter, he wasn't able to predict the difficulty of the rank error in a dungeon. Moreover, it would be difficult for him if Taehyun wasn't there. He considered finding a dungeon with a C-rank boss to prepare since growing as a D-rank awakened depended on understanding the value of mana absorption. Soon, the team successfully cleared the dungeon and went outside. Everyone thanked each other for their cooperation and said their goodbyes. And the protagonist, realizing that they hadn't said a word about his ability, was pleased that he had erased their memories. Suddenly, a familiar voice calling his name made him freeze. He immediately turned around and saw the leader of the Overkill Guild approaching, along with the secretary. Taehyun asked if he remembered him. Upon hearing that, the protagonist realized that the ability hadn't worked on him, so he sighed deeply and asked if he would believe him if he said he didn't remember. Taehyun handed him a business card and replied that he wouldn't believe it. He took the card and asked why he had come, to which he replied that he needed to talk to him about something, and that he needed a minute of his time. Looking at the information on the card, the protagonist thought that Overkill was one of the best guilds in Korea. He couldn't join such a large guild yet. He still needed to find an excuse to leave. After putting the card in his pocket, He turned around and said he didn't have time. He was in a hurry for an important meeting. But Taehyun didn't intend to let him go so easily. He placed a hand on his shoulder, saying that he wouldn't regret this conversation. It wouldn't take long, and he would also pay for dinner. Junseo remarked that being a guild leader must free up a lot of time if he was spending it on a D-rank support. Then the protagonist looked at him closely and thought that he didn't like this very much, but he needed to check how rental payment worked for him. As he walked past him, he agreed to talk, but only if it was quick. Taehyun smiled and agreed. After that, they arrived at a restaurant and got a table in a private room. When the table was set with several dishes, the protagonist asked why a guild leader would speak with a D-rank support. He doubted it was just because Taehyun had free time to talk to him. Taehyun said that from what he had seen, Junseo was a berserker. Due to his incredible strength, he needed a weapon that could withstand such force. So the most important part of Berserker's job was to find a supplier of suitable weapons. Obviously, he had gone to many places searching for them, traveling across the country and beyond, starting with a blacksmith considered the best in his field, and ending with the few remaining weapon creators. If there was even the slightest opportunity, he would commission a weapon. Time and money didn't matter. However, all the weapons he had used so far had failed to fully withstand his abilities, but there was only one exception: the sword that our protagonist had created. The protagonist understood one thing: the agreement had no effect on him. He hadn't thought that the berserker had a nullification ability. He had been too careless. He needed to be more careful when using that ability on high-rank hunters. Taehyun called his name and, with a serious expression, said he would ask directly. He then asked if the protagonist would like to join his guild, surprising Hizu. He stated that he already knew Junseo wasn't a member of any guild. If he joined, Taehyun promised he would receive the best treatment. They would pay 10 billion won for his entry, cover operational costs separately, and provide dividends, with a 1-year contract and a 10% increase for each renewal. Junseo didn't let him finish. He stood up from the table and apologized. He said he had no plans to join a guild for now, so he would have to decline. If that was all, he was leaving. He thanked Taehyun for the meal with a slight smile and left the room. Taehyun called out, trying to stop him. Hizu asked why he had made such an offer, since he couldn't have done it without a reason. She was about to say something about the conditions, but he interrupted her, saying that if she had experienced the same thing he had, she wouldn't be saying that. It had been a long time since he had felt the cry of a weapon, and with a weapon like that, it felt like he could do anything, and it endured. She wanted to say something to him, but as he took a drink, he said that, of course, it wasn't just because of that feeling. He then asked how many high-level weapons had broken in a single year. His words reminded her of the astronomical amounts he spent on weapons. Even though they broke because they couldn't withstand the strain, if the weapon wasn't of a certain rank, it wouldn't allow the guild leader to use his abilities. After thinking about it, she agreed with him and said that if it were possible, then such a price for a contract was truly insignificant. But for now, the problem was that no one was capable of such a thing, not even among those considered the best. However, he didn't let her finish and said that Junseo definitely could. She was startled by those words, and he continued, saying that therefore, no matter what Junseo asked for, he wanted to recruit him at any cost. Time passed, and the protagonist walked down the street. However, he was still in disbelief after having rejected such an offer. The Overkill Guild and Yoon Taehyun. This would have helped him a lot, but it was still too soon. However, he just needed to be patient. He would definitely meet him again. Meanwhile, in an unknown dungeon, several goblin corpses were scattered across the floor, and a hunter watched as his companion had a limb torn off. Catching his breath, he looked nervously at the one who had done it and asked who he was. The man drove his sword into the hunter's body and said that it was quite amusing. In moments like these, people whine and beg to be saved. But the one who would become the hero was different. He looked at the only survivor with a smile. The boy asked why he suddenly wanted to kill them and take the trophy. However, the man replied that it wasn't that boring and that he didn't want to tell him. He pulled the sword from the corpse and said that telling something to someone about to die would be useless, but he would reveal it if he were defeated. He threw the sword over his shoulder with a smile and told him to come quickly if he didn't want to die. The hunter gritted his teeth and thought that he was definitely a difficult opponent because he would die if he stayed at a distance. Deciding to close the gap, he charged forward with a loud cry, thinking that he had to go for it even if he lost an arm or a leg. In response, the man raised his sword in front of him, blocking the strike. The hunter shouted, putting all his strength into it. Then he began delivering new attacks, but they were all parried. Watching the sparks fly from their clashing swords, the man suddenly knocked the weapon out of his opponent's hands, sending it flying high above his head. The hunter looked at the sword in shock, and then his opponent kicked him with full force, sending him across the hall. The hunter crashed against the wall and trembled in pain. He said it was sad. Dragging his sword along the ground, the man said that he had volunteered for this because it was the first rank domination of a hero. However, he didn't know he would turn out to be such a small fish. Still, the courage he had shown in doing this was worthy of praise. When his shadow loomed over him, the hunter begged for forgiveness with tears in his eyes and started pleading for mercy. However, the man didn't care and raised his sword above him, smiling as he said he would deal with him. Then he delivered a fatal blow from which a torrent of blood gushed out. He looked at him with disappointment and cursed, saying that he thought, for the first time in a long while, he was going to have a real fight. But this wasn't even a warm-up for him. He questioned the look of injustice on the hunter's face. However, he told him not to worry, as he would make sure to say that he fought bravely against the boss and died a hero. Taking out his phone, he snapped a picture of the corpse and said with a smile that this was something common in a dungeon with a rank error. After finishing, he looked through the photos. He said they weren't bad, the collection had grown. Scrolling through the images of the other dead bodies, he added that his whole life was dedicated to collecting. Suddenly, for some reason, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He told the priestess with disgust that he hated feeling that vile energy and ordered her to either conceal it or stop hiding it. The hall doors opened, and the priestess entered. Waving at him with a smile and apologizing, she said she was in a hurry because she had heard that there were valuable components there. He pulled the sword from the corpse and replied that there were only idiots there. She walked past him before he could finish speaking, and threateningly asked if those words meant he wanted to go against the will of the executor. He sighed in irritation, calling her sensitive and telling her to clean up the place. She used her abilities, agreeing and stating that she was an expert at it. With a grim expression, he reminded her of her promise that she would send him after an S-rank hunter. Because of that awareness, or whatever it was, he needed to kill them, but he couldn't use his full power, so he followed her only for that reason. The priestess approached the hunter's corpse, and creating a magic circle over it, assured him that he didn't need to worry, as she would contact him soon. A glow appeared in the corpse's wound, and he asked who it would be this time. A claw emerged from the dead hunter's body as the monster surfaced, and the priestess, with an admiring smile, called it a child and happily exclaimed that he was right. A tall, humanoid monster whose body burned with energy appeared before her. Time passed, and a new day began. Association guards and curious onlookers gathered around the open gates. Junseo, who had just arrived, noticed someone familiar and looked at him with displeasure. Taehyun, who was also there, adjusted his cap and asked if he was really there. Silence hung between them. After a brief pause, the protagonist asked what he was doing there. Taehyun replied that he had good eyesight to recognize him so quickly. Observing the case on his back, he commented that he only knew one person who carried a weapon like that. So what was he doing there? Taehyun responded that the guild member who was supposed to come had suddenly fallen ill, so he had been sent in their place. The protagonist didn't believe him and was about to question him when one of the team members called out, saying it was time to leave. Taehyun passed by him and suggested they enter the dungeon. The protagonist stated that he knew he would meet him again, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He decided to accept the situation and adjust his plans. Thus, they passed through the gates and found themselves in a spacious cave. Taehyun asked why Junseo didn't join a guild. He replied that he had already refused and didn't want to talk about it anymore. One of the men asked if they had heard about the gate auction that took place in Chunshin that morning. The man stated that he had heard the Hania guild had won. He added that a friend was there and said they placed such a high bid that no one dared to compete. Junseo became interested, wondering if they had really found something there. Taehyun asked if he was interested in buying a gate. If he joined the guild, he could easily acquire special gates above B rank. This wasn't just because of resources, but also because the guild's name granted certain privileges. Joining a guild meant a lot for an awakened individual. People admire and revere major guilds. A hunter not only gains employment, but also earns better income and rewards compared to others. Additionally, by becoming part of a guild, a hunter enjoys various benefits from its influence. For example, they can gain access to special gates that require not only skill, but also strong political connections. With this structure, the rare treasures obtained in such places are naturally monopolized by the major guilds. Taehyun stated that Junseo probably had a goal as an awakened. Whatever it was, it would be easier to achieve with overkill. He didn't understand why Junseo kept refusing. The protagonist sharply replied that it was none of his business. He understood why Taehyun was acting this way. Probably, no one had ever rejected an offer to join Overkill before. So to make it clear, he wouldn't join any guild under any circumstances. These words surprised Taehyun, who stood still for a moment. He thought, was it because of the injury he received after the destruction of the Dawn Guild, as he had read in the report, or something else? Whatever it was, he couldn't give up. Time passed as they advanced through the cave. The mage at the front began illuminating the path. They looked around when suddenly, a man bumped into something and exclaimed, "What is this?" He touched his hair, feeling a thread-like texture between his fingers, and asked, "Is this a web?" The girl raised her staff, casting more light into the area. The team leader stepped forward and said that this was where the monster territory began. It seemed that all the hunters there were rookies, so he briefly explained, even though they had all read the report. The spider legionnaires began to emerge. Although each creature had a low difficulty level, their peculiarity was that they lived in groups. According to reconnaissance analysis, there were about 50 of them, which wasn't too many. The hunters were warned about the paralyzing venom present in the creature's fangs, and were alerted not to let themselves be bitten. Taehyun crouched, pulled a sword from its case, and turned to Junseo, saying that the creatures were about to appear, suggesting that he stay close. The protagonist, with a sarcastic smile, replied that he didn't need to worry about an assistant. He should just prepare for the fight. However, Taehyun stated that all combat units had the responsibility to protect supports and assistants, regardless of skill or situation. That was a rule that all hunters had to follow. Junseo, with an unsatisfied expression, retorted that no one else adhered to principles like that anymore. But his words were interrupted by a shout from a team member announcing the creature's arrival. The noises grew louder, and everyone immediately prepared, lifting their eyes to the ceiling. The sharp sounds of the spider's claws echoed as they approached, moving along the walls and ceiling. Upon seeing the monsters, the swordsman trembled with fear, trying to calm himself and reminding himself that they would win if they followed what they had learned. Thus, the spider legionnaires appeared, individually classified as E-rank threats, but in groups, they reached D rank, increasing in danger as their numbers grew. A horde of creatures advanced rapidly, and the hunters braced themselves for battle. The swordsman assumed a stable stance, and with a precise strike, took down a spider, gritting his teeth and attacking again. Meanwhile, another hunter blocked the monsters with his shield, concentrating energy and repelling them with a powerful strike. The mage used her magic, creating sparks from her staff that pierced the enemies. Observing the battle, Taehyun concluded that despite being rookies, they were performing well, which gave him less concern. Junseo, who was watching the other side of the corridor, sighed in surprise, catching Taehyun's attention. He turned, and Junseo commented that it seemed like there were far more than just a few dozen spiders. At that moment, several of them jumped from the ceiling, attacking the group. Taehyun activated his skill, swinging his sword and burning multiple creatures. Their charred bodies fell to the ground. He continued his assault, reflecting that the durability of these spiders was lower compared to other monsters. Just by releasing a little energy from his sword, he could eliminate them without even using the blade, allowing him to finish the raid without damaging his weapon. Meanwhile, cries for help came from another direction. 3 team members were surrounded by a large group of spiders, making the fight increasingly difficult. The team leader exclaimed that the number of enemies was far greater than expected. Who had done the reconnaissance? There weren't just 50 spiders. There were hundreds. The situation worsened, and the mage announced that she was running out of mana. Determined to help, Taehyun ran toward them, calling Junseo to follow. However, the protagonist went in the opposite direction, saying it was better for him to help the others while he finished up there and joined the group later. Taehyun stopped, confused, as he watched him walk toward the monsters. When a spider leaped to attack him, he ran forward, worried, shouting for him to get down, thinking that without using energy on his sword, he might get hurt. But at that moment, Junseo stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his irises had changed color, reflecting a web forming on the ceiling. The spider that had entered the web was immediately impaled by a sharp blade, and Taehyun was stunned by the scene. The spider's body fell at Junseo's feet, and he calmly analyzed the situation. Among all the weapons he could create at that moment, the sword would be of the highest quality. It would be more efficient to create multiple swords and use them simultaneously, but with his current mana reserves, that was impossible. With a slight movement of his finger, he pulled the sword from the spider's body, pointed it forward, and thought there was nothing better he could do at that moment. At his command, the sword rose into the air and began spinning around him, waiting for his next order. Observing the nearby monsters, he turned and pointed his finger at them, sending the sword hurling forward. As it approached the monsters, the sword pierced through one spider in its path, and then moved on to the next, cutting swiftly. With just a flick of his hand, Junseo controlled the sword, making it sweep through the cavern at a furious speed. At one point, he raised his finger toward the ceiling, pointing at the remaining spiders. After that, the sword shot forward and spun around them like a tornado, piercing everything in its path. When it was over, Taehyun looked at him in shock, then at the many corpses lying at his feet. Then he shifted his gaze to the sword embedded in the spider's body. He wondered, confused, if that was some kind of area attack as he watched the sword dissolve. And he reflected that in less than 10 seconds of combat, Junseo had dealt with those dozens of spiders. Had he used materialization in battle? He didn't even know that supports could fight like that. Noticing his stare, Junseo pointed a finger toward the rest of the group and asked what he was doing. Wasn't he going to help them? Because of his words, Taehyun suddenly remembered the other teammates he had initially run to help. He turned and saw that they were barely managing to stay on their feet. Realizing the situation wasn't great, he activated his ability and said they would talk after everything was over. Before leaving, Junseo called out to him and pointed at the bodies behind him, asking him to take care of them. After all, they wouldn't think an assistant had done all that anyway. Taehyun lowered his mask, thinking about it for a second. Then he pushed off the ground and moved forward, burning the bodies. Soon, the battle was over, and the team members gathered to rest. One of the hunters thanked Taehyun for his help, saying they had survived thanks to him. But he was a bit surprised. At first he thought he looked familiar, but who would have guessed he was the master of the Overkill Guild? Taehyun apologized for not mentioning it sooner and explained that he wanted to explore the dungeon discreetly. The mage was thrilled to discover his true identity and thanked him. Then she admiringly said it was incredible to watch him handle all those spiders. A little embarrassed, she hesitantly asked if it would be possible to take a picture with him once they got out. The hunter who had returned with Junseo cut her off before she could finish, loudly announcing that they were back. She made a disappointed expression, thinking she had lost a golden opportunity. The young man smiled apologetically for the delay. They began collecting secondary resources, walked around the area, and it seemed there were no more monsters left. He pointed to a dark corridor and said there was another passage over there. He thought they could move forward. The leader sighed heavily and said he didn't think they were in any condition to continue clearing the dungeon. It was a shame to do so, but they should wrap it up there. The swordsman exclaimed in surprise that they were so close. Why had he decided that? The man stood up and crossed his arms over his chest, saying that the number of spiders they had encountered, the dungeon's geography, and everything else were different from the intelligence report. Dungeons exist as portals separate from the world. They are areas with strange creatures and geographical features that cannot be found on Earth. Currently, the concept of dungeons and awakened beings is not fully defined, so for novice hunters, information about dungeons is the most important thing. Few awakened individuals can adapt to a dungeon if they have never encountered one before. This means defeat and, in the worst-case scenario, death. That's how explorers came to be. Awakened individuals with detection or stealth abilities band together and begin gathering information about dungeons. The rank of a strong dungeon increases after such reconnaissance, and thus they began to be called explorers. The accuracy of these reconnaissance missions generally exceeds 98%. It is unlikely that this is just an error. One cannot rule out that this might also be a misclassified dungeon. The swordsman was confused and wanted to argue, but then he turned his gaze to Taehyun and asked if, with the guild master with them, they might still be able to continue. And the man said he understood that they wanted to keep clearing the dungeon, but the guild master's help alone wouldn't be enough. If they weren't careful, everyone could end up in danger. Frustrated, the young man said he really wanted to clear the dungeon because he had personal reasons. Was there really no way? The girl also expressed her frustration, saying she wanted to finish the dungeon, and he asked what could be more important than their lives. If they entered the boss room, there would be no turning back. He also didn't want to leave, but they needed to report the situation first. The guild leader joined the conversation and said he agreed with them. The team leader looked at him with a confused expression, and Taehyun stated that even though he was there to study everything, he was still a member of the group. If the leader decided to continue clearing the dungeon, he had no reason to object. However, if he wanted to study everything, he would have to enter the boss room. He glanced at Junseo, who nodded in agreement, and the man bowed, saying he would trust him with this. Thanking him, he started to talk about being the team leader, but Taehyun reassured him, asking him to continue leading. The man agreed and announced that they would move forward. He instructed the others to follow, and as they passed through a large corridor, they found themselves in front of a set of doors. The leader stopped and informed them that he believed they had reached the boss room, so he would give some final instructions. First, the boss of this dungeon was a Legion Queen Spider, ranked D+, with considerably high combat abilities. It was considered a relatively easy boss, mainly focused on birthing Legion spiders. However, those were just the initial reports, and no one knew what kind of creature would actually be behind that door. He pushed the doors open, announcing that they were entering. As the doors slowly swung open, illuminating the space, the group moved forward. As they advanced, Taehyun frowned, realizing that he couldn't sense any particular presence, nothing at all. The leader raised his shield in front of him and warned the group to prepare. That's when they spotted a massive spider hanging from the ceiling, and he shouted that it was the boss. At that moment, the swordsman asked if that was the queen spider they had talked about. Relieved, the mage commented that it was good the boss was as expected, then gripped her staff and declared that she would attack first. She conjured a sphere of sparks and launched it forward, striking all the monsters with an electric shock. With a satisfied smile, she clenched her fist, but her eyes soon widened in shock. The queen spider's body fell to the ground, torn apart, with half of its abdomen missing, something that clearly wasn't caused by the mage's attack. Seeing this, the team leader became nervous, wondering if the boss was already dead. He had never heard of something like this before. Realizing something was wrong, he ordered the group to retreat, but they all felt a powerful pressure coming from the corpse and wondered what it was. Another queen's leg landed on the torn abdomen of the spider. She let out a loud cry, spread her arms wide, and summoned her army. It was Arachne, a B+ ranked queen who ruled over all types of spider monsters. She possessed high intelligence, was extremely cunning, and did not reproduce. Instead, she invaded the territories of other similar monsters, expanding her army at their expense while also sharing her power with her subordinates. Arachne smiled as she observed the frightened people and then swung her leg to finish them off. However, suddenly, a flame emerged in her path. Taehyun blocked her strike with a swing of his sword and stared at her, thinking how he would never have expected this monster to appear here. He knew that without swordsmanship skill, he wouldn't even be able to scratch Arachne. With just one strike, his sword had already cracked, and he reflected that he needed to inflict as much damage as possible with a single attack. He then advanced, delivering a strike to the monster's abdomen, but his blade shattered instantly, making him curse in his mind. Despite that, he left a deep wound in Arachne's abdomen before retreating, thinking that with his broken sword, he wouldn't be able to land a fatal blow. The moment he landed, the Spider Queen had already raised her leg to attack, but she was intercepted by a sword that suddenly appeared, blocking her strike and protecting Taehyun. Junseo advanced while the guild leader focused on buying time to create a new weapon for him. When Junseo finished creating the weapon, he suddenly felt something strange and shuddered. Looking at his palm, he wondered if he had exhausted all his mana. Reflecting that it was already incredible that he had lasted this long, he pulled a potion bottle from his pocket. After drinking it, he thought about how the potion could only be used once per day since excessive use would cause dependency. He tossed the bottle aside and, feeling a surge of energy, commented with a smile that the effect was excellent. Meanwhile, Junseo was deeply concerned, and in an instant a sword appeared in front of him. The creator of the sword told him to buy time. After that, he thought about how Arachne was a B-rank boss. If not for the error, there should have only been a C-rank boss called the Spider Queen. Thankfully, Taehyun was there because dealing with this monster would have been difficult for them. Not only did the danger level exceed that of a B rank, but the level itself was shifting. At that moment, the new Spider Queen swung her leg, striking at her opponent, who immediately blocked it by swinging his blade. She then began launching rapid attacks with a smile, which he swiftly countered. Watching them, Junseo thought that their raw combat power surpassed that of 5 A-rank fighters. As for Arachne's ability, it wasn't possible to rely solely on Taehyun. He told the rest of the group to get up because they needed to be ready to fight. Arachne had changed her target. The group leader exclaimed nervously, "Who is he?" The others stood up and asked why such a talented awakened one was secretly disguised as an assistant. He turned to them and, pointing at the small spiders rushing toward them, said they had something to deal with first. He waved his hand, creating a weapon, and told them to choose. They could either take the weapon in front of them and clear the dungeon by fighting the spiders, or they could run and wait outside until everything was over. Extending his hand toward them, he said he was sure they would make the right choice. After that, the group members picked up their new weapons and joined the battle. The swordsman swung his blade, slicing through the spider's body with ease, thinking that this was incredible. He had never wielded a weapon like that before. He swung the sword a few more times, preventing the spiders from attacking, and as he looked at the clean cuts on their bodies, he thought it felt like cutting through paper. Was it really that easy to kill monsters? Suddenly, a loud crackling sound distracted him from the battle. The mage had used magic, and her staff began emitting electric sparks. She was so fascinated by the sight that she smiled broadly. Then she confidently swung her staff, bringing down lightning upon the spiders. The team leader was utterly shocked. He had thought only the weapon had changed, but the power of their abilities had increased several times over. Did he really create such a good weapon? After the girl's strike, only charred corpses remained on the ground, and the team leader, turning his gaze back to Junseo, exclaimed in his thoughts, "Who is he?" Meanwhile, Taehyun's sword was still intact. He paused after a series of strikes and clenched his teeth, thinking that this was to be expected from a B-rank boss. It was difficult to buy time. His opponent grinned widely and then let out a loud scream, leaning toward him, her body already covered in multiple cuts from his attacks. Igniting his sword with flames once more, he thought that he needed to finish this as quickly as possible. And Arachne, seeing the light emitted by his blade, froze for a moment. After that, Taehyun lunged forward to attack, but she wasn't going down so easily and swung her arm. He was faster and delivered a powerful fiery strike, making her collapse instantly. Afterward, he looked at his blade and thought that the weapon was still intact. It was better than he had imagined. Suddenly, he noticed several small spiders on the ground moving toward the girl, who, looking around in alarm, exclaimed, "Where did they come from, and where are they going?" The group leader shouted that they were all heading toward the guild master. Taehyun turned to them and ordered them to fall back. After that, he thought to himself, did she hide the spiders? The situation was dire. She activated her ability. The spiders completely covered the wound on Araken's body, and Taehyun stated that she had sacrificed the spiders to restore her health. After that, all of Araken's head wounds were healed, and she looked at her opponent. Then she pushed herself up with her hands, helping herself to stand, and once again rose over the man. Looking at the queen spider and the 1,000 small subjects behind her, he said that until they were all dead, she would continue regenerating repeatedly. He activated his ability and rushed in to attack, thinking that he needed to increase his firepower to end everything in one go. Suddenly, his blade broke, and upon realizing this, he cursed loudly. At the same time, the protagonist smiled and said that he was better than he had imagined. He extended his hand forward, creating a weapon once again, and said that although he had created a sword with the remaining mana, he didn't think it would be destroyed. After that, a massive sword was embedded into the ground near Taehyun's feet, and the protagonist told him to take it. It wasn't a one-handed sword like the ones he had used before. It was the strongest weapon he could create at the moment. Without saying a word, Taehyun placed his hand on the hilt, and as soon as he grabbed the sword, he felt that with this weapon, he could defeat them all in one strike. The blade in his hand immediately ignited in flames, and fiery cracks began to spread from the tip along the ground. He smiled and said that he wasn't very familiar with two-handed swords, but it seemed to suit him well. After that, he pulled the sword from the ground, using all his strength to hold it, gritted his teeth, and charged forward. As soon as he was close enough, he swung the sword and unleashed a powerful fire strike. Araken grew nervous, clenched her teeth, and her face was illuminated by a burst of flame that soon passed through her body, followed by a deepening explosion. Junseo thought that the explosion was a basic berserker ability. This was probably the first time Taehyun had fully used it. A berserker loses control of themselves in exchange for gaining overwhelming power, so he probably hadn't used it before because it was difficult to manage the risk of the weapon shattering. Meanwhile, Taehyun lowered his sword and stood still. Then, flames began to escape from his mouth, followed by a powerful burst of energy that released all the fire. Afterward, the flames gradually subsided, and he sighed, thinking that had been dangerous. If he didn't release all his power, he would lose his sanity. He looked at his trembling hand and thought that this was only the second time this had happened since his awakening. Finally, he had managed to use this ability properly. Then he looked at Junseo, thinking that he had been wrong. Junseo wasn't just an ordinary awaken. Once his ability was discovered, the entire world would focus on him. This thought unsettled him, and he decided to take another look at Araken's shattered body. The protagonist approached and also examined it. Noticing the purple aura, he thought that there was an incredible amount of mana. It wasn't even comparable to other dungeon bosses with a bug. He turned to Taehyun and asked if he felt anything coming from that corpse. Taehyun responded that no, she was definitely dead. They had gotten rid of her remains, so she was no longer alive. At that moment, the protagonist realized that not even a high-ranking hunter could sense this mana, so he stepped closer. As he did, his passive ability activated, and the aura began to flow into his body. His magic bar was completely filled, and the system notified that 150 mana units were currently accumulated out of a total of 100. If the collected magic exceeded the limit, a reward would be granted. He obtained a new ability, Demonic Weapon Production. This was an active skill that consumed 100 units of accumulated mana to create weapons from the demonic realm. At the moment, he had no demonic weapons stored. They would be stored once created and could be materialized without using additional mana. He could use this ability once per day and thought that he couldn't even imagine what a demonic realm weapon would be. Although he had no memories of the demonic realm, could it be what he was thinking? It was a pity that the reward wasn't related to mana. But this wasn't bad at all. His magic bar was reset to 50 units, and he thought that thanks to Araken, he had already obtained half of the required amount. It seemed the reward ended there. Suddenly, Taehyun interrupted his thoughts, called out to him, and said that he had something to tell him. The protagonist turned to him, asking what was wrong, and he replied that he wanted to apologize. He bowed to him and said that despite his refusal, he had still insisted that he join the guild. It was rude of him, even as the guild leader. Junseo, clearly not expecting this, was slightly surprised, and the man closed his eyes and said that he truly regretted it and wanted to apologize. The protagonist felt uncomfortable and asked what he was suddenly doing. At that moment, the team leader looked in their direction and nervously wondered, "What am I seeing right now?" Taehyun bowing to a D-rank assistant. From what his abilities indicate, he is clearly not an ordinary person. He must be a hidden talent from the Overkill Guild. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the swordsman's voice, making him flinch and immediately turn around. The man waved his hand with a smile and said that it was dangerous. They had searched everywhere, and there was nothing left there. The girl walking beside him shared his thoughts, saying that Arachne must have absorbed all the monsters in the dungeon beforehand. The man looked at his disappearing sword and asked, "Isn't this an incredible weapon?" They can cut through monsters without wasting any energy. She agreed with his words and said she had never heard of a weaponsmith capable of doing something like that. Is he from the Overkill Guild? Suddenly, the team leader ran up to them and wrapped his arms around them, nervously urging them to leave so he could contact the association. The man looked worried and asked in confusion why exactly they had to leave already. The girl agreed with him and said she wanted to thank both the guild master and the assistant first. The excited leader waved his hands and suggested they quickly leave that disgusting place. At that, the swordsman looked confused and replied that they had already understood, so he should stop insisting. After that, the team leader led them to the exit, glancing at the rest of the team while thinking that despite the obvious connection between this assistant and the Overkill Guild, it was best for them to leave. If they interfered with the affairs of a major guild, there would be no end to the trouble. Whatever the emergency was, releasing such power so easily was not something typical of large guilds that prioritized security. Junseo sighed and agreed to talk, saying that although he had used the rental contract, the guild leader shouldn't bow to someone he barely knew. Taehyun said that the guild would no longer trouble him, and of course neither would he. But that statement didn't mean they had given up. This was their first chance. The protagonist crossed his arms over his chest, looking at him with suspicion, then extended his hand, offering to make a contract, saying he was sure he would like the terms. A new day arrived, and the protagonist went to the Overkill Guild building, where he found Hizu at the reception. She said she was happy to see him again and introduced herself. Today, she would be responsible for handling the contract. Junseo thanked her and said that the guild leader had mentioned he would contact him immediately. But who would have thought it would be the very next morning? She replied that the leader had asked to prepare everything as quickly as possible. He asked where they were, now that they had arrived. She responded that this was Overkill's special reception room, a highly secure place, so he didn't need to worry about privacy. Then she placed the contract on the table and asked him to read it. These were the conditions the guild leader had mentioned in the dungeon. It would take some time, but he could modify the contract's content, so he shouldn't hesitate to say what he thought. The protagonist picked up the contract and read it carefully. Then he thought with a smile that, just as he had said in the dungeon, now that everything was settled, it felt more real. He placed the contract back on the table and said he had no questions and that they could proceed. While discussing the contract terms in the dungeon, Junseo had been confused about the guild supporting him, and Taehyun clarified that it wasn't official support but secret support. Of course, this was just speculation, but he vaguely understood why Taehyun didn't want him to join the guild. For several reasons, he needed to hide his identity. If he was right, then his suggestion might help. They could secretly supply the materials he needed. Equipment, ingredients, gate rights, it didn't matter. He only needed to sign a contract as a formality. Everything would be provided in secret. Of course, the protagonist asked why they were suddenly being so generous. He replied that naturally, it wasn't just out of kindness. He would have to complete missions personally assigned to him. These were his conditions, but he wouldn't force him. If he didn't like the missions, he could refuse. Junseo laughed and asked what would happen if he didn't help but still received his support. He replied that it would be fine as well. The main point of the contract was to create a bond between the guild and him, preventing him from joining others. Accepting the support was nothing more than a sign of his loyalty. That was all. Suddenly, strong footsteps were heard nearby, and they turned toward the sound. The association members ran up to them and said they were from the Hunter Association team. One of them clicked his tongue at the guild master and asked if he was okay. Realizing it was time to leave, Taehyun turned and told Junseo that he would hear his answer outside. He hoped the answer would be yes. If he had overwhelmed him too much, then he shouldn't respond. Finally, he turned around and with a smile added that to him, his ability was the best. Reflecting on this, the protagonist picked up a pen and thought that, according to his plan, he wanted to leave a lasting impression on Taehyun and continue his relationship with the Overkill Guild without joining it. But for now, this would still be useful to him, so he signed his name and handed the document to Hisu, asking when he would start receiving support. She replied that from now on, he should let her know if he needed anything. She took a small box from her bag and placed it on the table, saying that the guild master had prepared a gift for him as a memento of the contract. She had heard that he had found something useful in Arachne's room. Junseo was curious, opened the box, and mana started to seep out, so he closed it and put it in his backpack, thanking her with a smile. He handed her a list of the materials he currently needed and asked when he could receive them. She looked at the list and replied that there were many things, so she thought it would be possible within a week. However, perhaps she was meddling in something that wasn't her business, but she felt that these materials wouldn't be useful to him. So he got up from the couch, put his backpack on his shoulders, and replied that he wouldn't use them. He just wanted to give them to someone else. Time passed, and he went to the Hunter Association to see someone. He took out his phone and checked the time, thinking that she should have arrived by now. When a timid girl entered the association, he smiled, thinking that the A-rank hunter Han Jia had finally arrived. The girl hesitantly walked toward the counter, but in his future memories she had a completely different personality. When she fought against monsters and shot arrows at them, creating huge holes in their bodies, she was very confident in her skills. After the players were selected, this genius hunter was called the Archer Goddess. Now, without taking her eyes off the ground, she approached the counter and turned to the association's attendant, saying that she wanted to request a training pass for the gate. She handed over her ID and asked with a smile, since she was an A-rank hunter, if they should give her a C-rank gate. She refused and, with a shy smile, said she would like to obtain a pass for the D-rank gate, which surprised the attendant. The man looked at her information on the computer and saw that she had entered the gate only twice. He thought she had recently been classified as an A-rank hunter, but even considering that, she had almost no experience. She had only entered the gate a few times. He had seen lower-ranked Awaken give up on everything before, but not A-rank ones, so he quickly glanced at Hania, who was filling out the documents, and thought that she probably had her reasons, but she would soon be demoted. The first rank of the Awaken is based on the amount of mana. When the blue energy poured through the rifts, mana entered all human beings, but each absorbed a different amount. The more the body could store, the better a person's abilities were. So the association started calculating how much mana each person had. Those who could control more than a certain amount were called Awaken, and then they began ranking them depending on the amount of mana. Of course, the rank is not fixed. Even if the rank is low, a hunter can carry out dungeon raids, and if they gain fame within the association, they can be promoted. Of course, the opposite also happens. At that moment, Hania handed the documents to the girl with a smile and said she had filled out everything, offering help with the registration. Does she have a partner? The girl excitedly replied no and said she would then register her on the partner list. According to the rules, it is necessary to carry out incursions in groups of 2 people. So far, there had been no requests for the demotion gate, so she would have to wait a little. She asked if she could go alone. Hania replied that she could, but only if she had permission to enter alone. However, considering that she was registering, she did not have that permission. To obtain it, she needed to pass the test. Did she want to sign up for it? Hania got nervous and asked her to wait, and then the girl said she needed to tell her something. In a month, she would have a rank update. Hania, about to leave, froze in place at those words, and the girl continued, saying that she had probably seen the message. But to confirm her rank A, she would need experience clearing a rank C dungeon or higher or passing a rank A test. She thought the test would be more suitable for her. She would probably receive a message about it soon. She hoped to succeed. Hania thanked her excitedly and then left the association, thinking that it was difficult even to request a training gate, so she would need to make an online request. Coming to such a crowded place was madness. She decided to come because she thought she wouldn't be demoted. She composed herself, and remembering her experience clearing the dungeon, she thought that it was a rank D gate, so something like that wouldn't happen again. If she didn't rush, everything would be fine. Suddenly, a message arrived on her phone, and she nervously adjusted her glasses, thinking that they had said she would have to wait for an invitation, but it had already arrived. As expected, rank D. She was going alone anyway, so it didn't matter. She needed to accept quickly. A new day arrived, and she approached the rank D gate. She walked hesitantly toward the portal and thought that she hadn't dressed like this in a long time. It felt so unusual for her. The protagonist, who had become her partner, approached and asked for her name. Then he introduced himself, saying he hoped they would get along well. Hania made a slight bow and said it was a pleasure to meet him. He smiled timidly, apologizing for being late. They needed to go quickly. She agreed excitedly and said that she had made a request and then talked to the association staff. At that moment, he thought that she was a ranger-class hunter who had originally been ranked A, but after continuously failing the tests, she was one of those demoted to rank C. Even under such conditions, she received the title of Archer Goddess because after becoming a player, she discovered a talent within herself, and he knew what kind of talent that was. It was a talent that could be discovered within oneself, even without being a player, and today he wanted to awaken it in her. After that, they entered the dungeon and found themselves in a forest in the middle of the mountains, where goblins were roaming freely. A small group of goblins was patrolling the area. Hania, who was hiding behind the bushes, peeked discreetly and thought, "Are they gone? Are they really monsters? Good thing she decided to buy this." She looked at the bracelet and thought that it was equipment that detected the mana of monsters. She turned to her partner and apologized, saying she would go alone. She asked if she could do the killing alone. She promised to give him all the loot and compensate him for everything. He crouched in response and told her not to worry. If she needed help, she should let him know. At the very least, he could create arrows. Then she stood up, thanked him, pulled the arrow on the bowstring, and aimed, telling herself mentally that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry. Finding the right moment, she released the arrow, which left a magical glow as it passed, then approached the goblin. When it turned, the arrow struck its head. The second goblin quickly moved out of the attack line and grabbed its bow to shoot back. Behind them, there was an explosion caused by the arrow colliding with something. Pulling the bowstring again, Hania released another arrow but missed. Junseo, on the other hand, watched her and thought that he had never seen her fight before she became a player. Her raw destructive power was much greater than that of a rank A, but it was useless if she couldn't aim. At that moment, Hania fired another arrow and made a hole in one of the monster's bodies. Then she thought that one of the 3 arrows had hit the target. That was her record. This way, she could kill at least 4 more monsters. She needed to finish everything with 2 shots. Just as she was about to shoot another arrow, she suddenly stopped, noticing that one of the goblins was blowing a horn, alerting the others to the danger. She didn't immediately understand what that meant, but then goblins appeared in the clearing, and feeling the pressure from all sides, she froze in place. Her bracelet beeped, warning of danger, and as she looked around, she realized she was surrounded. She was confused and nervously thought, where should she shoot? Forward or backward? What should she do? At that moment, the goblins behind her decided to attack, but suddenly, an intense glow appeared in front of her. Many swords embedded themselves in the ground, stopping them from advancing, and Junseo walked toward Hania, smiling and saying he needed her help. She exclaimed in surprise, asking if he hadn't said he was a D-rank creator. He replied that he had, and then his sword began to dissolve. He said it wouldn't last long, so he needed her help. She turned to him and asked what she should do. He pointed his finger at the monsters hiding behind the bushes and told her to shoot there with all her remaining strength. She agreed and aimed again, thinking that she didn't know what he was planning, but she would do as he asked. After that, she fired an arrow that flew at lightning speed, destroying everything in its path. She warned her partner about the shot and asked what she should do next. He grabbed her hand and said that with her shot, she had cleared the way. Now they needed to run. At that moment, the monsters rushed toward them, and she was very surprised to see him running from them while pulling her along. Soon they distanced themselves from the monsters and found themselves at the entrance of a cave. Hania caught her breath and wiped the sweat from her face, saying they had survived. Then she thought, where were they? And she wondered if they had gotten rid of the goblins. She remembered that while they were running through the forest, she had looked back and had the feeling that they wouldn't be able to catch up with them anymore. Was there really something back there? So much had happened that she couldn't even understand. She looked at her partner, who was lighting up the cave with a lantern, and mentally thought, why is he so calm? They needed to get out of here quickly. She smiled shyly and said that she was done for the day, that she would pay the compensation he had mentioned. He replied that they couldn't leave yet. They were concerned, so they would stay there for a while. It was too dangerous to leave now. It seemed they had left a trail while running, so they had no choice but to wait for the goblins to move away. She exclaimed, when could they leave then? He turned to her and replied that it could take half a day, but depending on the situation, it might take longer. Hearing this, she shuddered and then clutched her head, exclaiming, half a day? Deciding they were doomed, she knelt in despair and he scratched the back of his head, thinking that of course he was lying. They would be far away in about 30 minutes, and the goblin's focus wasn't that strong. It was a pathetic reason, but at this point, it seemed like Hania would believe anything. He looked again at the cave entrance and thought that this was because he needed to force her to enter the cave with him. As he pondered this, he closed his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. Then he imagined her running out of the cave in panic and thought he doubted she would agree. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Hania's guilty voice. She stood up, bowed, and apologized. All of this was her fault. If she knew how to fight, if she had gone alone from the beginning, none of this would have happened. She felt terrible about all of it. Nervously, she gripped her weapon in her hands and thought that once again, she had caused problems. Even in a D-rank dungeon, she was acting like this. She was desperate. She shouldn't have even tried. She started crying and gritted her teeth, telling herself she shouldn't have come here. Junseo extended his hand to her and snapped his fingers in front of her face. Distracting her from those thoughts, he said that if she felt guilty, then he would let her do something for him, and that she needed to pull herself together. She hesitated and asked what the request would be. He turned toward the cave and said they had plenty of time. Then he looked at her with a smile and added that he would explain everything in detail. After that, they entered the cave together and began moving forward, lighting the path with the lantern. Hania hesitated and asked if he really needed her help. She was an A rank, but she didn't have much experience in dungeons and didn't even understand what he meant by an elite monster. He smiled, remembering that she had said this was her first time in a training gate, and said that now he understood why she didn't know. It wasn't very common knowledge. Instead of bosses in this dungeon, there was a lower-ranked elite monster, and it lived in that cave. For personal reasons, he needed to defeat that monster, but so far, he had been rejected and hadn't even been able to fight it. That's why she was the first to accept him as support for her team. Upon hearing this, she shrank back and remained silent, and he glanced at her, wondering if that had sounded strange. Gathering her determination, she pressed her lips together, then stopped and confidently said that she would help him if he didn't mind. Remembering the goblins in the forest, she thought that helping him was the right decision. Thanks to him, she had been saved, and she also knew how painful it was not to be accepted into a team. She needed to help him. Suddenly, her bracelet beeped, and at that moment, a loud sound of footsteps was heard. She became nervous, and the protagonist lit up the area in front of them. A huge goblin with a club in its hand appeared before them. It was the elite monster. Hania immediately stepped forward and pulled back her bowstring, telling Junseo to move away, then thought that even though the monster was an elite, it was still a rank D monster. If she hit it at least once, it would die. Her arrow became wrapped in magical chains, and then she released it. Seeing that it was following the correct trajectory, she rejoiced at her success. But suddenly, the goblin covered itself with the club, and the arrow went through it, leaving her stunned. With the impact, the goblin's leg slid backward, and she thought, did it deflect the arrow? She was wrong. She needed to shoot with all her strength. She pulled back the string again, but when she tried to release it, her body didn't respond, and her fingers refused to let go of the arrow's tip. Her hands trembled, and she thought nervously, why now? She needed to shoot. Hearing the loud sound again, she shifted her attention to the monster, and seeing it running toward them while swinging its club, she froze in fear. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed her and threw her back, causing her to fall, then stepped forward. Right after that, a loud noise was heard and dust rose. The monster had slammed its club into the ground with full force. Looking at the dust cloud in confusion, she called out to Junseo. She remembered being in the dungeon and found herself in a similar situation. A girl from her team exclaimed, "What is she doing? Is this all a joke to her? She can't even shoot properly, and when she did, it was in her direction. She almost died because of her. How was she going to make up for it?" Hania asked her to wait and said that although she had missed the target, she didn't intend to shoot at her. The girl gave a sarcastic smile and asked angrily, "She's not apologizing but making excuses. Does she think that just because she's rank A, the whole world is at her feet? She'll soon find out who she's messing with." After they left the dungeon and Hania went to the association, she was rejected from the team, and other hunters began whispering, asking if she was the rank A loser. They had heard that she almost killed someone in the dungeon, and also that she couldn't even kill a weak monster. Someone called her an idiot and said that's why even rank D teams rejected her. Another hunter asked what she was doing with her talent. What a waste! If she was like this, why was she still a hunter? Coming out of her memories, she looked at the monster with a dark expression and thought that she should have given up on everything. Because of her, even Junseo got hurt. At that exact moment, the goblin raised its club above its head, ready to strike. But suddenly, a bright spark flew between them, and Junseo said that he really was bad at acting. His sword easily blocked the elite monster's attack. Hania, realizing this, called out to him in surprise, and he loudly said that he knew it sounded meaningless, but she needed to listen carefully. If she calmed down and just did as he said, then they would definitely be able to win. He frowned and thought that he had prepared everything. In an emergency, she would be able to activate it without problems. All that was left was to buy time. He continued swinging his sword, attacking, and told her to look carefully at that idiot. She would see something and should hit that mark with all her power. But Hania was no longer listening to him. Her body trembled, and she started to get up, wondering what that feeling was. Her senses felt sharper. It was very uncomfortable, but she could see everything. Her eyes gleamed, and she pulled back the arrow again, thinking that now she could clearly see where it aimed. She drew the arrow and fully focused, closed her eyes. Then she opened them wide and thought that with this single arrow, everything would be resolved. She aimed and released the arrow, which left a brilliant light in the air. The goblin froze in place, hearing the whistling sound it emitted. The protagonist declared that, fortunately, it seemed everything had activated correctly, but for some reason, the activation conditions were very strict. Then the elite monster extended its club toward the arrow to shield itself from the strike, but the arrow pierced through both the weapon and the monster, leaving a large hole in its body. Seeing this, Junseo smiled, thinking it had been worth it, while Hania was both surprised and confused at the same time. Right after that, an explosion occurred. The severed limb of the monster fell to the ground from the impact, and the creature itself began to lose balance before eventually collapsing. Hania was still panting as the protagonist explained that it would feel strange at first. However, he stated that she had probably never felt her senses being amplified before. Still, he had resorted to some extreme methods to make her understand that sensation so she could realize her potential. Even so, Hania was still confused and asked how he knew all of that would happen. Also, what did he mean by her potential? He smiled and told her to take her time. They had plenty of it. She walked up to him and, in an irritated tone, told him not to change the subject and to answer the question. But before she could finish speaking, she suddenly felt a sharp pain grabbed her head and then lost consciousness. The protagonist had to carry her on his back all the way to the exit, sighing heavily and saying that making friends was really difficult. But at least one thing was resolved, right? When they exited the cave, She woke up, and the first thing she did was apologize to him, saying she didn't know why she had acted that way. She felt like she wasn't herself. She couldn't believe she had shown such disrespect to the man who had saved her twice. She was truly sorry for having doubted him and apologized for fainting so suddenly. He was confused by her apology, then touched his forehead in exhaustion and sighed, saying it was really fine. No one was hurt, and they had defeated all the monsters, so she should pull herself together. It had already been half an hour. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and he asked if she could give him the pendant he had given her. He clarified that he had given it to her before they entered the cave. Remembering that, she put her hand in her pocket and then handed it to him. He examined the pendant closely and noticed that the color of the crystal had changed. She had definitely used it. Meteorite perception was a rare item that could only be obtained in the A-rank dungeon called Burning Harpy's Nest. This item had an ability called Keen Senses, which activated automatically when certain conditions were met. For example, when a person shot an arrow at the head of the wearer of this pendant, their senses would become extremely sharp, enhancing their capabilities and allowing them to use superhuman perception. He returned the amulet to her and thought that the problem lay in the difficult conditions for activation. The wearer's emotions needed to be at their peak. For people like Hania, the best way to activate it was through intense fear, so he had made her feel insane fear. It seemed difficult, but he had managed to awaken her. Even at such a high price, there were very few of these pendants on the market, and he had already given up on getting one. But he figured that Taehan would find the item in 2 days, and thanks to him, everything had become much easier. But this was only the beginning. Hanjia only felt like she was awakening because of the item. She would need more practice to reach her original level. His expression grew serious, and he told her to listen carefully. Her first task was to ensure that her concentration was entirely focused on the monsters. To do that, she first needed to change her bow. She was strong enough to switch from a short bow to a long bow and shoot from a distance. Naturally, she wouldn't need to fight monsters up close, which would make her less afraid of them. He wanted to tell her something else, but she didn't let him finish and simply thanked him. He didn't understand why she was thanking him, and she said she was grateful for everything, including the pendant. When she thought she was going to die there, she felt something coming from him, as if everything around her had frozen, as if she could do anything. She saw where she was aiming, and the target was perfectly aligned with the monster. To be honest, even though she was A rank, in terms of character and everything else, she was no more than a D rank, and the more she tried to change that, the more disappointed she became. But she had the feeling that during this short period of time together, she had grown a lot. She felt that she was capable, that she could do anything. And for the first time, she allowed herself to go along with it. Realizing she had said too much, she became worried, but he smiled and said it wouldn't be easy for her alone. He would give her his number so she could call if she needed anything. She was very happy and thanked him. Then she said she would also leave her number. When Junseo was about to give his number, he noticed a message from Taehan asking him to call quickly because there was an emergency. He decided he would contact him once they left the dungeon. After some time, as soon as he and Hanjia exited the dungeon, he called Taehan, who thanked him and said he would call back after the meeting. Junseo smiled and said he would help if he could. Last time, Taehan had given him something very useful. Taehan replied that he was glad it had been useful to him. He was happy that Junseo had agreed to help him. After that, he hung up the phone, put it in his pocket, and was looking out the window when he heard a knock on the door. Hizu entered the office and said that the association president had returned and that they could leave. Shortly after, the two arrived at the association building and walked down the hallway, but Hizu was restless. She commented that the situation was very unusual. Normally, he would send an official document. Who would have imagined that the association president would summon him? He had been sending difficult orders through documents. But if he had called him personally, maybe the ranked S gate had appeared again. Taehan replied that it was fine. Junseo had agreed to help him. If he fought like before, there would be no danger. He thought with a satisfied smile that he was right to establish a working relationship with Junseo. Hizu, on the other hand, was worried, thinking that he seemed more excited than after the Arachian dungeon, probably all because of that creator. He had been acting strangely ever since. Unlimited support. Who would have thought the guild master would make such a surprising offer? She knew that berserkers had difficulty controlling their emotions, but the guild master was calculated and sensible. Could Junseo be more capable than she had imagined? But she immediately dismissed that idea, thinking that a D rank couldn't create a weapon he truly liked. He rarely invited him, so she needed to find out everything in person. Taehan noticed her suspicious look, and then the two arrived at the office door of the president. The guard outside greeted them, asking if he was alone. Taehan was slightly surprised by the question and asked if someone else was supposed to come. The guard then responded that, from what he had heard, 2 guild leaders were expected. If they were alone, he could wait. Taehan asked if he could find out who the other leader was. The man noticed someone behind them and then pointed ahead with a smile, saying that he had arrived. Iok, the leader of the Shinwa guild, appeared behind them and upon noticing Taehan, he exclaimed in surprise. Hearing his voice, Taehan and his secretary immediately turned, and Aeok waved at him, saying he had heard he had been very busy lately. Taehan remained silent, and Hisu frowned, thinking that this was the only person who irritated the guild leader. Hyo gave a fake smile and said he didn't expect to see him there. Taehan frowned slightly, holding back his anger. The Shinwa guild master approached and asked who this was. And if it isn't the idiot guild leader of Overkill? Declared Aeok. Taehan remained silent, thinking about how irritating he was. Mocking, Aeok said he was wrong. After all, it wasn't the guild that was the problem, it was the leader. Taehan said he was too busy to respond to his absurd provocations. Aeok said he must be busy choosing low-level dungeons. Are you comforting yourself by making the rookies admire you? He taunted. Hisu didn't like that and asked what he was trying to say. Aeok stated that it seemed true since he hadn't gone to those dungeons to save anyone. After all, he had tried to clear a rank A dungeon and was misclassified. She was surprised, and Taehan placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her not to respond to that. She wanted to object, but didn't. He turned to the guard and said they would go in. Then he opened the doors and told the association president that the leaders of the Overkill and Shinwa guilds were already there. Jilman Han replied that he already knew. He could hear their argument from there. He smiled and added that they never changed. Soon after, both entered and Hisu remained outside. The guard looked at the girl sitting next to him a bit hesitantly and offered her tea, but she politely declined, saying she was fine. Meanwhile, the two guild leaders, Taehan and Aeok, were seated in front of Jilman Han. He looked at them and said there was an urgent task for their guilds that needed to be completed immediately. 3 days ago, an unspecified gate appeared on the outskirts of the city. Scouts were sent to investigate it, but none of them returned. Taehan frowned and asked if this gate was an error gate. Jilman Han replied that, as he had already mentioned, the gate was undefined, and even measuring its mana was extremely difficult. Aeok exclaimed in confusion, trying to grasp the situation. Taehan thought it was strange that the gate couldn't even be evaluated since tools for that purpose normally existed. The rank of a gate was usually determined by 2 factors. First, the amount of mana inside the gate was measured using a special tool, which allowed for determining the gate's rank. Usually, the gate's rank corresponded to the rank of the monsters inside. Second, the intelligence data sent by the association to assess the situation was compared. Jilman Han stated that, as they already knew, rank error dungeons emerged when the amount of mana inside suddenly increased. However, this time, it was impossible to measure. Taehan asked if they had tried sending more scouts, and he confirmed that they had done so multiple times, but none of the scouts returned. Io placed his hands behind his head in frustration and asked irritably if they had no information about the dungeon's rank or what it contained. He suspiciously questioned whether the association was trying to shift the blame for what had happened. The president of the association responded, explaining that they didn't know how long the veil of the unknown rank gate would last. If they didn't act soon, it was very likely that monsters would start emerging from the gate. He reminded them that this had happened in the past, and every time it did, it turned into a complete disaster. Then, with a serious expression, he added that he understood how his words might seem pushy. But this was truly an emergency, and this time, no refusals would be accepted. He wanted the Overkill and Shinwa guilds to join forces to clear the undefined gate. He would have liked to send the Hayama guild as well, but they couldn't participate due to a sudden mission abroad. This case was serious enough to gather the 3 largest guilds. He set a 2-day deadline for preparation, stating that he would provide funding and the best possible reward for completing the mission. Of course, if they needed anything, he would assist them in any way possible. Reflecting on what he had said, Taehan asked if the cleanup team should consist only of guild members. Jilman Han replied that it didn't matter. Since the existence of this gate was causing chaos and panic in society, he could only allow a small number of trustworthy individuals to participate in the mission. Seeing Taehan's reaction, Yaeok looked at him with a slightly surprised expression. Taehan then smiled faintly, his confidence evident, and said that he understood everything. After that, Yaeok returned to his guild and, tossing his jacket to a subordinate, ordered them to gather a team of A rank or higher guild members and select those who would be available in the next 2 days. Remembering Taehan's smile, he thought that cunning guy definitely had something up his sleeve. What was that smile? He was so irritating. He would definitely take this opportunity to crush him. Annoyed, he ordered that Yurin Kang be included in the team, which surprised his subordinates, and insisted that she be invited without fail. The subordinates, upon hearing the order, became nervous, surprised that the leader was demanding the presence of a girl who usually refused to help anyone. The girl, excited, said that given her personality, she would definitely refuse, to which Aeok sharply replied that they should do whatever it took to make sure she showed up, and warned that if she didn't, they should be prepared to change their roles. The guild members, frightened, quickly confirmed their understanding and dispersed to carry out the order. Still burning with frustration, Aeok headed for the elevator, thinking that Yurin Kang normally didn't help anyone, but he planned to take advantage of the situation and recruit her. 2 days later, the first part of the team, composed of Overkill Guild members, gathered at the gate. A girl named Junseo Shin asked what time it was since the others hadn't arrived yet. A man with glasses said there were 5 minutes left until the scheduled meeting time. They were always punctual. Clearly expressing her distaste, she spun her weapon in her hand and said she couldn't stand those pompous idiots. They had no manners. Her expression hardened, and she asked if they would learn anything if she shot them in the head. The man, outraged by her words, smacked her on the head, telling her to be careful with what she said. She clutched her head in pain and said he was brutally strong. He stepped toward her in a threatening manner and asked what she had just said. After that, she started running, and he chased after her. Junseo, observing the scene, commented to Taehan that the members of his guild got along very well. Taehan replied that although it seemed that way, they were very reliable in battle. He was grateful that Junseo had accepted. To be honest, he thought he would refuse. The protagonist smiled slightly and said he had used the item Taehan had given him. He was proud of it too. Turning his attention to the guild members who had already started fighting, he thought that, of course, this wasn't the only reason. He had a secret mission that would take place in a dungeon with a story. There, he needed to put an end to the abandoned world and receive rewards. The dungeon's opening time was 168 hours. Additionally, the mission window had unknown coordinates and rewards written on it. 5 days ago, this system window with a secret mission, something only a small number of players received, had suddenly appeared before him. The selection of players had not yet begun, but he had already received the secret mission, so he saw no reason to refuse. Although these missions had very high difficulty levels, if he completed them, he could receive incredible rewards. Some even awakened new abilities. Who would have thought it would be the same dungeon? Suddenly, Taehan distracted him from his thoughts, and he looked at him, meeting his serious gaze. He apologized in advance for that idiot's rudeness, and then Ayok's voice was heard nearby, saying that they were a little early. The vice leader and Jaehui immediately stopped fighting. Taehan stepped forward while Ayok apologized to them, saying they had a lot of work. They understood that, but it seemed like the Overkill Guild had too much free time. Arriving at the meeting location with his team, he said with a sarcastic smile that they had been clearing low-rank gates. Because of that, Jaehui became really irritated, but the man, stopping her from moving, asked her not to respond and to ignore them. She wanted to object and was about to insult them, but he immediately silenced her and asked again to ignore them. At that moment, Junseo stood at a distance, thinking that the Overkill and Shinwei guilds were still on bad terms. It wasn't just an emotional rivalry between the guilds, but also a public dispute over which one was stronger. Ayok, noticing a new face among Overkill's members, looked closely at Junseo and let out a laugh, asking if he was their trump card. Then he declared that they had acted as if they had something, but in the end, it was just him. His laughter turned into anger, and he sighed heavily, saying that they had gone too far. Clearing the dungeon was a joke to them? Did they want to be carried out of there? The protagonist remained silent, and Ayok called them idiots. A girl from his team smiled and asked him to stop getting angry, saying they also had a new member on their team. A girl named Kang Yuren appeared behind them, and with a displeased expression, she reminded them that they had said they were short on time. She didn't think they had time to argue, so they needed to hurry. She took a step forward, and Junseo, upon seeing her, recoiled in horror, wondering what kind of composition this was. The strongest elemental master in Korea, capable of using all 6 elements, Kang Yuran, an S-rank sorceress, Kim Ayok, and their guild leader, Yoon Taehan. Did they really have such a star-studded team? She remained silent about Junseo since she didn't know about his abilities. Then she sighed with a smile and said that it would be easy. She would be happy to handle all of this. After that, they headed toward the gate, and Junseo thought that it wouldn't be easy. In his previous life, the attempt to clear this dungeon had failed. Out of the 8 team members, only Yoon Taehan had survived, mainly due to his infiltration ability. After that, the gates suddenly disappeared. It was an unprecedented case in which all high-ranking Awakened ones were declared missing. The association worked tirelessly to find any information, but nothing about the dungeon was discovered. There was no guarantee that they would succeed this time, but after being in the dungeon for a while, everything turned out contrary to their expectations. Their opponents, the puppets, were so weak that the battle was incredibly easy for them. This made Junseo nervous, and he wondered why everything was so easy. Some time ago, a portal with a glowing ring had lit up at the grand entrance to the dungeon. Jugwi commented that the mansion was really cool, and Myongan told her to be quiet. The whole team was walking inside the dungeon when Myongan heard a strange sound coming from the portal and turned around. There he saw the gate closing forcefully, and the others turned at the sound. He tried to open the doors, but nothing happened, so he suggested breaking them down. The man shouted that he wanted to destroy the doors, and then they started trying to break through the gate. He counted loudly from 1 to 3, and the others struck the gate forcefully. They were surprised and asked what was happening since the door didn't even budge. Unsatisfied, the man told everyone to step back because he would do it himself now. However, he didn't have time to try because, at that moment, strange sounds were heard behind him. He turned around and saw several eerie dolls. He attacked them, asking what those creatures were. With his strike, the dolls shattered into body parts, and the rest of the team also began fighting the monsters. His attacks were especially powerful, and he questioned how those creatures dared to attack them when they were so weak. A girl called out to him, saying he could use his skill. However, he replied that he was fine. There was no need to use a skill for something so trivial. But soon after, the girls shouted for the leader to turn around because the monsters were reanimating behind him. The dolls began reassembling their bodies with the help of mana. He grinned maliciously, noting that their revival ability was kicking in. At the very least, this ability would be interesting to watch. So he threw a punch, and two enormous mana fists appeared beside him. The dolls continued their attack, but he began striking them fiercely, pummeling them with his magical fists, which trapped them between blows. The rest of the team also fought the monsters using pistols. Junghyun from Jaehui's team killed the dolls by slicing them apart with his spear. At that moment, only Junseo and Yurin remained on the sidelines. He asked if she wasn't going to fight, but Yurin asked him the same question. He explained that he was just a support. Yurin stated that there was no need for her to fight. She didn't want to work hard for a team like this. She observed the powerful flames unleashed by Taehan. He swung his flaming sword, setting the dolls ablaze as they melted away. Yurin said she was interested in seeing Korea's strongest awakened in action. She wasn't impressed by the guild leader's fire and commented that everyone seemed ordinary. They couldn't even kill a single monster. If she had known this would happen, she would have refused the mission. At that moment, Junseo looked at the dolls and their glowing threads. He thought it was strange, the contaminated mana and these monsters. They weren't in their usual form. He noticed that every movement of the dolls was accompanied by a movement of the threads. When he looked up at the ceiling, he saw the source of the threads. All the mana was connected to that artifact. All he had to do was destroy the item, but he didn't want to reveal his real abilities. But then he thought he could use the agreement, and everything would be fine. He didn't have time to act because he was distracted by Yurin, who killed a nearby insect using a magic crystal. The protagonist looked closely and asked if she had enough mana to use on insects. Why didn't she use it to attack the threads above? She pointed at the fly and asked if she hadn't already given the reason. The insect was incinerated in a swarm of lightning, and Yurin responded that she killed whoever she wanted. Junseo thought, while looking at the insect's ashes, that maybe there was no need to investigate further. He started creating something and said that maybe Yurin was afraid of insects. After making that guess, he began forming something out of mana. She replied that she wasn't afraid of things like that, and besides, he should stop talking to her because he was annoying her. Junseo apologized and said he didn't mean to intrude, but there was also an insect up there. He created a shield with a spider beside him. Yurin said it was irritating and prepared to attack with fire. Junseo immediately withdrew the shield, and she unleashed an enormous and powerful stream of fire onto the mass of threads. A giant fireball destroyed everything, and Yurin was confused. One of the dolls stopped moving, and at that moment, Aoyok struck another doll. Then he thought, why was that troublemaker Yurin using her abilities there? But suddenly, he felt something strange and looked at the doll. He lifted it by the head and asked what was happening. Why weren't they resurrecting anymore? Annoyed, he squeezed the monster's head and said that he had finally warmed up. But in the end, weak monsters couldn't do anything. The wall was broken and glowed with intense mana. Junseo walked toward it and began absorbing the mana. He realized that this was the source of the doll's resurrection. If he hadn't noticed the contaminated mana, he would never have found the origin. Thus he assumed that this could have been the reason the dungeon cleanup had gone so wrong. Taehan stood in front of a mountain of dolls, their bodies in pieces, and said that they were finished. But since they still didn't know everything, they needed to search the entire first floor. The man with glasses said he understood and asked everyone to follow him. He ran ahead and knocked down the door with his body, but Aoyok overtook him. He shouted for everyone to get out of the way because he would be the first. There were more dolls in the room, and Aoyok started punching them. The protagonist looked around the room and thought, is the contaminated mana gathering in that cabinet? He pointed to the cabinet and asked Jakuri if she could shoot at it. She didn't understand at first, but then decided to follow his advice. When she shot, the weapon shattered into pieces. Everyone was shocked. Myongan didn't understand what was happening or why everything was dying so suddenly, and Jaehui tried to distract him. Then they went through all the rooms and managed to finish the first floor quickly. Tahan was the first to go up to the second floor and said that since they had cleared the first floor, they could proceed. Aoyok, dissatisfied, said he already knew that. It was time for him to stop acting like the leader. Taehan turned around and didn't respond but led Myongan and Jaehui forward. She smiled and spun the gun in her hand, saying it was a beautiful thing, and Myongan looked at her enthusiastically. Aok was furious at that moment. He thought Taihan had decided to ignore him. How irritating. He wanted to crush his pride. Suddenly, he felt something unpleasant and looked at his palm. He didn't understand what was happening. Something had hurt him for a second. Had he overdone it? However, he ordered his team to move forward. Heron said she would go with the leader, and there was a staircase with a strange incline. Junseo was watching them, which worried him because according to Taihan, there was nothing special there. He separated from the team and entered one of the rooms, deciding to check everything himself. It was dusty and dark. He covered his nose and soon saw many threads with an infected aura on the floor. He was surprised to see so much mana, but suddenly a loud noise was heard. At that moment, Aok was fighting fiercely against the monsters. He shouted that he didn't have time to use a skill. The other team members fought the monsters with the same bravery and fury. They shot and tried to cut the monsters into pieces, but nothing worked. Taihan held his ground and deflected the monsters' blows with his sword. He asked if everything was okay. He realized they were being attacked by a high-level invisible monster. Myongan shouted that he was fine. Jehu was nearby and said she was also fine but couldn't see the guy who had been with her. He asked her excitedly and started searching the room. It was as if he saw different wind currents with the movement of each person. He started to worry because he hadn't noticed that Junseo was missing. He began shouting and calling for him. At that moment, the protagonist was near the source of the contaminated mana and heard a scream. He realized the battle was getting harder, but he had already absorbed the mana, so he needed to hurry. Suddenly, a hidden passage opened before him. He looked down into a dark basement. The protagonist thought, "Are there enemies down there?" But he decided not to overthink it and began to descend. A figure started to appear before him. He was then surprised to see that it was a child, and he wondered what a child was doing there. The cute girl saw him and immediately smiled. She started walking toward him and asked if he was a hunter. She didn't wait for an answer, telling him to follow her, and then ran down the stairs. Junseo reached out and shouted for the girl to wait a moment. How did she know he was a hunter? The girl replied that her sister upstairs had told her that a hunter would come to save her, and that if that happened, they should leave together. She asked, did Junseo come here because he was the hunter who came to save her sister? He asked in surprise who her sister was. The girl asked how her brother didn't know her. That was strange. She was sure he was talking about her. They went down and saw a girl sitting there. She had a strange and eerie appearance. The girl said they had arrived. This was the person she had been talking about. The protagonist looked at the girl in surprise and thought that she seemed to have suffered psychological trauma for some reason. He apologized, saying that the Hunter Association had sent him. She asked again, was he from the Hunter Association? Had they really sent him? The protagonist replied yes. He knew this might be confusing, but he asked her to tell him what had happened. She collapsed to the ground in relief and said she thanked God. She was very grateful. Then the sad girl began to tell her story. She was the 4th scout to enter this dungeon. The first 3 did not return, so she was ordered to explore it. However, as soon as she entered, the dolls rushed at her from all sides. She was caught off guard and tried to escape through the door, but for some reason, it closed and wouldn't open. She was trapped. Junseo recalled how they had entered the dungeon and realized she had been in the same situation. He asked if she knew what had happened to the other scouts. The girl replied that she did. She had called out to them at the entrance to check, but something seemed off. It was as if they weren't conscious. They had a strange aura and looked terrifying. Her former teammates tried to attack her. She managed to escape and eventually found this girl. Although she was trapped, this girl had helped her a lot. The little girl said it was true. Her sister played with her a lot. Junseo asked what the girl's name was. She replied that her name was Elizabeth, but he could call her Beth. He then said it would be better for them to go together. It was too dangerous to stay alone there. The girl said it was dangerous inside. She thought it was much more dangerous outside. At that moment, the team was fighting an invisible monster, running around the room, attacking blindly and hoping to land a hit. Sparks constantly flashed as their swords made contact with the monster. During the fight, Taihan noticed that the enemy's boots were becoming visible. He realized that the camouflage was gradually fading. Soon, the creature's figure and clothing became fully visible. He thought, are these humanoid-type monsters? He saw an identification card fall to the ground, and when it became completely visible, he realized it was a scout's ID card. It belonged to Han Cholsung, a B-class hunter. Taihan recognized that the attacker's face matched the documents of the scouts the association president had given him. Jaewi shouted that she also recognized that face. Manhun continued attacking while Taihan hesitated and only defended himself. Then he shouted for everyone to stop attacking. These were the missing scouts. Soon, the figures stopped hiding completely and cautiously observed everyone around them. Taihan knew that stealth was an ability that couldn't be used for a few minutes after activation, as it carried the risk of significantly slowing down movement. Suddenly, he was distracted by a shout. It was Aok, furious, glowing intensely with his aura as he screamed. He was convinced that this was a monster using camouflage. But were these really the scouts? He clenched his magic-infused fist and said that it didn't matter, their speed had slowed down. He summoned a massive mana fist and declared that he would kill them all at once. Aok struck with full force, but nothing happened. There were two teams and scouts on both sides of the long corridor. A drop of blood appeared on Aok's nose. He shouted in frustration, "What's going on?" Jaewi's weapon was smoking. She had fired a shot and now asked if Guildmaster Aok had gone insane. They weren't monsters. They were people who needed to be saved. There had to be a way to restore them to their original state. He asked, "They're people. We need to restore them. When someone tries to kill you, there are only two choices: kill or be killed." It didn't matter who showed hostility toward him. Anyone would be eliminated. The sharpshooter was no exception. At the same time, the scouts' heads began to fall. Aok's mana fist seemed to fly through the hall, destroying them all. He glared at them with anger and said that if they tried to stop him again, Jaehui should know that she would be the first to die. Myongan shielded Jaehui from both Aok's punches and the chaotic mana, as well as from the scouts. Jaehui shouted that he was a bastard. Taehan firmly told him to stop. He hoped Kim Ahyok would listen now. Hyok said he was irritated that people were blind to the truth, but he would show them reality. At that moment, the girl protected him with a shield and asked him to also repel the enemy attacks. But Taehan said this wasn't a request. It was a deal. He would hand over the mission reward and all the funding to the Shinhwa Guild. He thought these conditions should be enough, and Ahyok was surprised by such an offer. The scouts continued running around them, attacking. Ahyok dodged a strike and warned them. If they annoyed him, he would kill them right there. Taehan also avoided several sword attacks and thanked them for their patience, thinking he had finally bought some time. Suddenly, Jaehui called out to him. Myongan was blocking her strikes, and she, embarrassed, showed her weapons and admitted she had done it. Taehan, panting from exhaustion, said that she would deal with the consequences later. Right now, they needed to focus on the battle and figure out how to save them. The scouts turned invisible again, but in reality, they were the same dolls. However, there was an incredible number of threads in their chests. They were contaminated. Beth asked, "Did brother also see the dolls outside? Does he agree that they are very scary?" She didn't know exactly how, but they were intertwined with purple threads. Their entire bodies were made of long threads. The dolls wouldn't die until the threads were removed. They would keep attacking constantly, but the threads were strong and very difficult to break. She asked what her brother and sister thought about this. "Wasn't it scary?" the protagonist asked. "So the dolls can return to their normal form." He wanted to bring back his comrades who had turned into dolls. The girl then said that she had heard that they needed to stop the device attached to the doll's body as soon as the thread was broken. But if they tried to remove the threads by force, the dolls' bodies would be torn to pieces. Beth smiled and asked, "Did that information help? Did it really help?" Junseo began to observe her carefully with eyes filled with mana. It was strange. Even a difficult question, she answered precisely and kindly. Maybe she should ask him another question. Beth replied that only 20 seconds were needed. Just 20 seconds after the dolls used camouflage, they would die. The team continued fighting against the dolls. They were already exhausted, with wounds and blood showing on them. Now everyone was being struck by the dolls and struggling to block the attacks with their shield. Jaehui shouted, "This is bad. We can't handle this. Can Kang Yurin help? She just needs to freeze their movements or something." She snapped her fingers, quickly blocking an attack, and said not to push their limits. She was irritated by what was happening there. At that moment, Aok was already counting. 10, 9, 8, 7. The team kept fighting, all tense. His mana aura shone intensely, but he continued the countdown. He raised his fist, and at that moment, a gigantic mana fist hovered above his head, ready to strike. However, in an instant, the fist evaporated and disappeared. Aok remembered that this had happened before. The ability was cancelled, and the pain from the past returned. At that moment, Junseo arrived and said that Aok had interrupted his ability just in time, and they had barely managed to save the situation. He walked with a girl who was smiling widely and declared that he would take care of everything alone now. Taehan approached and asked where he had gone. He replied that he needed to check something, but that there was nothing to worry about. The guild leader commented that it was good that nothing had happened. Jaehui noticed something strange and turned around, seeing the blurred figures of the enemies. She shouted that they were starting to use stealth again. The fighters began running toward the group at incredible speed, aided by mana. Taehan positioned himself to protect Junseo and the frightened Beth, telling them not to move. Like bright beams of light, the enemies passed the surprised Jaehui and Myongan, heading straight for the protagonist. Taehan was shocked, thinking, "They went right past me." He shouted for Junseo to be careful, but the protagonist was already completely calm. Thanks to the infected mana threads, two fighters attempted to attack him. However, Taehan appeared in front of them, blocking the attack with his sword. Junseo's eyes gleamed. He said that he could see the doll's weak points and that he would mark them now. The fighters should aim precisely there to avoid damaging the main body. Taehan replied that he understood. He looked up and thought, By marks, does he mean these blue fragments? He started using the hilt of his sword and struck directly at the fragment on the doll's chest. He was relieved to realize that this method worked. It was incredible to aim like this. He spotted another fragment and alerted everyone that the doll's weak point was the device in the center. They needed to hit exactly there. Jonghyun from Eok's team struck a scout's chest with her spear. The device shattered, and she shouted. Eok, displeased, questioned why the dolls were breaking now when that hadn't happened before. He didn't understand what was happening. The protagonist gave a subtle smile, and Ayok continued asking, "What's going on?" Soon, they stopped fighting the scouts, who were now unconscious. Tahan asked if they could know what Junseo had been checking on the first floor. He replied that he would tell them since it wasn't anything special. He had explored the dungeon alone and accidentally found a surviving scout. She was in terrible condition, so she didn't come with them, but he had learned what was happening from her and discovered the scout's weak points. Tahan asked who the girl next to him was. She was looking at them with a smile, and Junseo explained that she had helped him find the scout. It seemed that her parents were trapped there. Ayok leaned toward the girl and said that this was very suspicious. Joey questioned what the leader found suspicious about her. She was just a child. He pointed at her with displeasure and asked what was wrong with his reasoning. It was logical. How could an ordinary girl be there? The portal was heavily guarded, and even if it seemed like she had been overlooked, the association constantly monitored it. No one could enter. Taehan stated that he understood Ayok's point, but judging her hastily was wrong. Ayok became furious and shouted that they were just obsessed with finding flaws in his words, weren't they? Besides, Junseo was walking around so confidently because Ayok had let his guard down. Should he just kill all of Tahan's guild members then? The leader of the Overkill Guild was also irritated. His eyes glowed with a dangerous aura. He said he didn't like pointless arguments, but he found it necessary to teach Ayok the importance of discipline for the sake of a smooth raid. Jaewi declared that since they thought they were the best, they should use this opportunity to prove it. However, the girl beside her stated that they really were the best. Annoyed, she asked Jaehui why. Instead of talking nonsense, she didn't try to stop her guild master. What would she do if he was killed? Jaehui, equally irritated, asked if they really believed Master Taehan could lose. The other girl countered, stating that her master definitely wouldn't lose. Jaehui shouted that she wanted to stop Taehan, but not before demanding that she stop saying that. And if he lost consciousness, would they even be able to carry him out? The argument between the two girls escalated. Their voices grew louder, and the aura surrounding them shone menacingly, taking on a toxic hue. Meanwhile, the guild masters also began shouting, declaring that it was time to determine who was stronger. Giant mana fists and destructive flames erupted between the two groups. They shouted that they would show each other the truth of the situation. Suddenly, the protagonist felt pain. His aura began to shine intensely as he bent over, questioning what was happening. The emotions in the environment were growing stronger, almost uncontrollable. Then he heard laughter. Beth was laughing. Her aura was equally intense and dangerous. With a sinister smile, Beth revealed that she had only provoked their emotions a little, and they were already fighting like that. How shameful. Looking at Junseo, she thanked him, saying that thanks to him, she was able to use her mind control ability on them without raising suspicion. It was necessary to approach discreetly, and he surely understood that now. At that moment, the protagonist remembered that from the beginning, he had suspected Beth might be a childlike monster. Her aura was murky and dark, but when he started seeing her as just a normal child, that was when he realized he might have been under mental manipulation from the moment he met her. He quickly understood that he was already too late. Panicking, he ran toward the guild leaders, his own aura activated, determined to prevent the worst. However, as he approached, Junseo realized he couldn't move. His body was wrapped in threads infused with contaminated mana. And it wasn't just him. Everyone in the area was bound by the threads, which led directly to Beth, who was manipulating their anger and resentment. The protagonist understood that they were all already under mind control. Who could have imagined that Beth was using contaminated mana to manipulate both body and mind? His eyes burned with fury. He couldn't accept such a deception. Forcing against the threads, Junseo activated his passive mana absorption ability. Gradually, the threads began to fade. His aura shone intensely with the contaminated mana he absorbed. Beth had chosen the wrong enemy. Soon, the threads started breaking one by one, and the fighters snapped out of their trance. Eok, confused, asked what had happened. With a sinister smile, Beth admitted that she hadn't expected him to be able to absorb mana. Still, she found it amusing. However, Junseo shouted that Beth was an enemy and ordered everyone to attack her. Her smile faded, and she began calling out for her father and mother. The air vibrated as powerful waves of energy cascaded from the ceiling, creating dazzling flashes of light. Beth pointed at the fighters and told the two new individuals that those people were intimidating her. She asked them to punish them. Two imposing and beautiful dolls appeared before the combatants. Aok immediately rushed to attack them. Taehan tried to restrain him, but Ayak shouted for everyone to leave him alone. saying he would destroy the doll with a single strike. With a snap of her fingers, Beth sarcastically declared that it was time for her brother to appear. At that moment, a controlled Aeok struck one of his own teammates with a powerful punch, sending him crashing into the wall. Taehan, shocked, shouted, asking what Kim Aeok was doing. However, Aeok wasn't listening. Contaminated mana emanated from him, and his mouth was filled with threads. He couldn't understand what was happening to his body. Junseo was alarmed. Now it made sense why he had sensed contaminated mana in Aeok's hand earlier. Beth mocked the situation, saying that her brother liked to hide behind humble people, but no one ever noticed. Laughing loudly, she provoked them and declared that they should fight against one of them, questioning what they would do now that their ally had turned into a puppet. Taehan, irritated, gripped his sword and declared that he would capture Aeok. The other fighters agreed, and the environment echoed with the sound of strikes, gunfire, and swords as the confrontation continued. Suddenly, a barrier surrounded Kim Aeok. Everyone, including Rubis, was surprised. Jaewi shouted, asking what was happening. A girl from the guild explained that the barrier was an ability that activated automatically when the guild master felt his life was in danger. During this state, he became invulnerable and could not be distracted, similar to a storm period. This ability could last for hours. He could no longer control Aeok, and at that moment, the brother only wanted to be left alone. Beth, dissatisfied, complained that now one of them couldn't fight, making her brother useless. She declared that she only needed to deal with the other three. The fighters positioned themselves in front of Aeok's barrier, preparing for battle. Beth stated that it would be better to finish everything quickly. Junseo noticed that based on the energy emanating, these dolls were far more powerful than the previous ones, comparable to bosses in a difficult dungeon. The fight was inevitable because ignoring these dolls would be dangerous. Although he had a bad feeling, Taehan decided that it was safer to face them. He instructed Myongin, Jahui, and the others to focus on the female doll while he dealt with the male doll. Jahui, with her weapons ready, confirmed the order. The father doll was the first to attack, and Taehan quickly wielded his sword, enveloped in flames, to counter. Meanwhile, Aeok remained motionless inside the barrier, as if frozen in a block of ice. Rubis, unable to control or free him, was frustrated. The protagonist declared that Aeok's invincibility state had caused an error in their ability to control people who had become puppets. Despite being the same ability used to turn hunters into puppets, he stated that something felt off. Junseo recalled that Aeok had transformed into a doll instantly, even after he had absorbed all the contaminated mana. That meant that before his absorption, Beth had the opportunity to transform them but chose not to. This made the protagonist suspicious. As he was thinking, Jahui began fighting the mother doll, firing multiple shots that failed to penetrate the doll's barrier. Beth, watching, smirked with disdain. Junseo was confused. Everything seemed like a game to Beth, but at the same time, something didn't make sense. Why had she revealed herself so obviously? Why had she led the group to the Lost Scout and exposed the weaknesses of the other dolls? After gaining their trust, she had shown her true face, making everything pointless. However, despite thinking about it a lot, everything still felt strange. It was as if she were being forced to fight, a situation that didn't make sense for someone who only sought to create internal conflict. The father doll continued its relentless attacks. Taehan, dissatisfied with the doll's absurd resilience, wrapped his sword in mana threads and unleashed a powerful strike. He intensified his flames and activated his berserk ability, further increasing his weapon's power. Meanwhile, Jahui, realizing that her conventional shots were useless, pulled out a special magazine with mana bullets from her pocket. She prepared her mana pistol, a weapon reserved for critical battles like this one. After concentrating, she fired an extremely powerful enchanted bullet. The projectile pierced through the doll's barrier, causing massive damage and leaving a flaming hole in its chest. With the mother doll severely wounded, she collapsed motionless to the ground. Shortly after, the father doll also fell. Taehan lowered his flaming sword and took a deep breath, exhausted from a much harder battle than expected. The strangest thing, however, was that the dolls had only used physical attacks without any special abilities. Looking around, Taehan realized that only one doll remained. He worried about mental attacks, but strangely, he could resist. So he warned the fighters to stay alert and prepared, instructing them not to advance without further orders. Beth, saddened, murmured that her mother and father had been destroyed. Taehan was the first to advance against her, while Beth protectively hugged the remaining doll. Suddenly, her smile widened into a disturbing grin, and she declared that everything was perfect. Taehan didn't hesitate. With a swift and precise strike of his sword, he cut off Beth's head. Blood gushed intensely, and the doll she was holding fell to the ground. Everyone was shocked, but Jahui, proud, asked if everyone had seen what she did. They had worried for nothing. After all, nothing less was expected from the guild leader. Yuren in turn complained, saying that Beth acted as if something terrifying was about to happen, but everything ended up being extremely monotonous. Junseo wished it were like that and that his bad premonition was wrong. A system panel appeared in front of him. Upon reading the information, he was shocked. Tahan looked at the destroyed doll covered in blood. Although it was a monster, the image of a child deprived of life was deeply unsettling. He was preparing to announce a break for everyone, but something unexpected happened. Tahan froze and began to tremble, just like the other 4 hunters. It wasn't magic or a psychic attack. There was something in the dungeon they had never faced before. A strange substance began to form from Beth's remains. Everyone felt the overwhelming presence of a monster. Junseo realized he was right. As expected, a hidden boss appeared. It was the ancient vampire, Elizabeth Bathory. On the system's taskbar, the main objective was clear: destroy Elizabeth Bathory. As a reward, he would receive Demon Shackle, and the additional objective was unknown. From the middle of the substance, a girl emerged, surrounded by splashes of blood. She thanked them all, stating that she had been waiting for those who would destroy her mother and father. She explained that they had betrayed her, forcing her to live forever with her powers, besides being ungrateful, as they had placed her in that useless body. Stretching her arms and back, she joyfully declared that she was finally alive again. Elizabeth lamented that she had spent so much time harboring hatred against them while being trapped in such a weak form. Yoren called Jahui and Myongan, ordering them to prepare for battle. She herself began to increase her mana power. Even knowing that her guild leader was talented, it would be impossible to face Elizabeth alone. Elizabeth watched Tahan as he prepared his sword and mocked them, calling them adorable rats. Her provocative tone enraged the fighters. She then released a powerful flow of mana from her hands, an ability called Essence Drain. The ground was soaked with blood, and all the fighters began to cough violently, spitting blood. Myongan shouted that this was absurd. Yoren trembled, blood flowing from her eyes, mouth, and ears. She knew that high-ranking undead were masters of absorption magic, but she had never seen it used at a distance and on so many people at once. Despite this, Tahan managed to focus and launched an attack. His flames filled the space like a whirlwind. Elizabeth was surprised and admitted that even in that state, Tahan could cause trouble. However, if he had access to all his power, things would be different. Elizabeth grabbed his sword and broke it into pieces with force. She declared that he would never defeat her, and then struck him. Tahan was sent flying, colliding with the ground and coughing up blood. Trembling and unable to stand, Junseo approached and asked how many % he thought he had used. Confused, Tahan asked what he was talking about. Junseo explained that, as a berserker, he had power, but his body wouldn't withstand it if he used 100% all the time. When he killed Arakan, he had the impression that he had used less than half of what he was capable of. Furthermore, he had been using even less afterward. Tahan confirmed but recalled that even so, the strongest sword Junseo had ever made had been destroyed. In his current state, he wasn't sure if he could unleash a power greater than what he had already shown. Junseo, however, extended his hand, asking if Tahan was willing to share his power. He knew it was an absurd request, but he insisted anyway. Surprised, Tahan felt the energy emanating from Junseo's hand. It was mana, but it felt different. Junseo explained that it seemed to be a permanent connection between them. He then became serious, enveloped in a dark aura, and declared that it was time to show their skills. He created demonic armor, and the system notified that 100 units of contaminated mana had been consumed. The system began searching for a suitable weapon in the demon world. Elizabeth watched them in surprise, and soon the creation was complete. A flaming weapon appeared before Tahan, the demonic sword Leviathan. The protagonist declared for Tahan to take the sword. Now it was his turn, the berserker. Thus the guild leader looked at the sword, fascinated, and realized that something had changed. The mana was different. If the sword had many abilities, he would have taken it easily, but there seemed to be something different about that flaming sword. So he extended his hands toward the weapon since it was a sword created by Junseo. As soon as he touched the sword, he was blinded by an intense firelight. A strong wind blew toward him and around him. Elizabeth also looked at this massive explosion of power. She realized that this was a sword with contaminated mana. From what she felt of the energy, it must have been a special fire element ability. She said that contaminated mana and flames made for a rather good synergy. The protagonist looked at Elizabeth in surprise. She was confident in her strength and was already preparing to attack. The synergy of mana and flames was good, but unfortunately not for them, as she used blood. She pointed her hands at them, and from her feet, a stream of blood flowed down the stairs and across the floor. This was the ability of the blood territory. When the blood reached Junseo's feet, he became worried because this was a large-scale ability that seemed to drain energy. Although the absorption power was not as strong as before, it was still a very versatile ability. The rest of the team was already lying on the ground, powerless. Elizabeth said that their mana distribution and basic metabolism would gradually become paralyzed. Everything would melt: bones, muscles, nerves, veins. But all the team members were already unable to move and were breathing with difficulty. The vampire considered them weak playthings. She said that after a while, the pain wouldn't be so bad. Suddenly, Taehyun was in front of her with a flaming sword and aura. Elizabeth was confused and dissatisfied because, even after activating her blood territory, he was still moving well. No, to be more precise, he wasn't moving well. His body was not being moved by his will or consciousness. It was the sword's ability. Even the strength he could display now, she thought, was much greater than before. She clenched her fist and said it was fine, that now things were getting fun. Now she had to destroy the puppets. Drops of blood flew from Taehyun's steps. He quickly rushed toward Elizabeth to attack. At that moment, she gathered all her mana, using blood magic once more. And when she raised her hands, 2 giant hands made of blood rose from the ground. This was the ability Thirsty Hands. She pointed them forward. The massive hand quickly approached Taehyun. He gripped the sword tightly and swung it, sending a huge flow of flames from the blade, cutting through the hand. Now even Elizabeth was frightened and questioned what kind of power this was. Right after, she immediately covered herself with another blood hand like a shield. She declared that she was twice as strong now. However, she explained that he had become even stronger than that. The protagonist was injured but said he was truly impressed by this ability. Taehyun used his most powerful attack, hitting the vampire directly. The room above and below was filled with blood. The guild master slashed Elizabeth's stomach. She coughed, her face contorted in pain. Junseo was surprised to realize that Taehyun had still been suppressing so much power, even though he probably didn't even know it. Soon, the room returned to normal, and the system informed that the main objective had been achieved. The hidden boss, the ancient vampire Elizabeth Bathory, had been successfully defeated. Now she was lying on the ground, lifeless and covered in blood. Suddenly, a small box appeared in Junseo's hands. He realized that this was a reward item. He hoped the item was somehow related to recovery or magical activity. The system informed that Leviathan's materialization had been unlocked. The sword in Taehyun's hands began to gradually disappear, registering the demonic sword Leviathan. Next time he used this ability, a separate search would not be necessary. He could simply materialize it. Junseo wondered if it was some kind of search function, although he didn't understand how it worked. It seemed to look for a random sword, or maybe there was some logic to it. When the sword disappeared from Taehyun's hands, he didn't understand what was happening. He felt very unwell and in pain. He was trembling and asked what was going on. The protagonist approached and told him not to even try getting up because, even if he did, he wouldn't be able to walk. Maybe he would be fine, but he was so injured, and the power level was so high, that Junseo was surprised Taehyun was still conscious. Looking at the hall, he saw that all the fighters were unconscious on the ground, and the protagonist said that Taehyun could rest since he didn't think anyone's life was in danger. Elizabeth managed to open her eyes when Junseo approached her and said she congratulated her brother. The protagonist didn't understand anything since she was in a critical state. However, the system declared that she had been defeated, even though she was still alive. So he asked what the story behind her and this dungeon was. The puppets were controlled by the same infected mana he had felt coming from her. However, at the same time, she couldn't control them, but still, they tried to protect her in the first place. Elizabeth replied that they would certainly try to protect her because she was a valuable source of power that fed them. A long time ago, she fulfilled all their whims, but while living alone, she simply killed huge and dangerous monsters. Normally, she wouldn't have done that, but one day she saved some rats that almost fell into the water. It was a family of 3. If everything had ended there, it would have just been a strange story. But that day, a woman came to her and bowed. These rats were unusual. They said they couldn't simply let their savior leave, so they asked her to accept their invitation. It was the first time she had heard something like that from a person, so she was taken to a beautiful mansion. The woman showed her a sphere filled with mana, and the man showed her giant dolls. Elizabeth didn't know what the critical moment was, but when she realized it, she was no longer a guest. She was part of their family. She taught Rubus how to control the dolls with mana threads. It looked cute, so she laughed. Though it was brief, she was happy until she realized why those rats had accepted her into their family. Even if it was for a short time, she liked to think that she had been happy before, until she understood the real reason why those rats had accepted her as part of their family. She declared that it was her fault. However, the fact that she had given them the chance to betray and then control her was proof that she had become soft and weak. So they trapped her in that body, sealing many of her abilities. That's why she provided the corrupted mana necessary to protect them. The protagonist asked what they needed protection from. Elizabeth replied that she herself wasn't sure. Although it was strange, she asked if he had ever seen the window in that mansion. Through the window, one could see a magnificent view, an endless desert that, no matter where one went, never ended. But that wasn't a real desert, just a barrier and a space created to protect the property. She was certain that her mother had created that space with her power, all to protect them from the monsters beyond the rift. After those words, Junseo shuddered. Elizabeth noticed his reaction, saying that he had also been affected by the rift. However, that was how he ended up in that place. So their worlds had been affected by the same things. The rifts appeared in the sky, awakening mana in various people, and numerous portals began to emerge. The monsters came through the portals, beings far more cruel than vampires like her. Junseo immediately became more interested and asked how the world had dealt with the portals, about the end of the world, and how many years had passed. She was surprised that they also called it a disaster. However, that was the conclusion, even though she hadn't been able to see it for herself. After being imprisoned in that body, terrible times came for her when she couldn't move. Elizabeth resembled a doll. During that time, her world crumbled, and the mansion was isolated. She was only able to move again recently. The lock on her box was open, and she was surprised. Since then, this had appeared before her eyes. Elizabeth looked at the system panel. There was a hidden task. She had to repel the uninvited guests who had come from another world. The objective of the task was to repel 100 uninvited guests, and the reward was the liberation of the abandoned world. The protagonist was shocked upon hearing about the system window because it proved that she was also a player. Elizabeth understood from his face that he had many questions, but she apologized, saying she couldn't answer them. Her body began to disintegrate like a stone statue. She said her death was near, but that it was also a good thing. But Junseo became nervous. This was bad. Her body was starting to collapse. At that moment, he remembered the reward. The item Demon Shackle was available. He opened the box with its shining mana and smiled. Soon, Elizabeth felt something and opened her eyes. Junseo quickly grabbed her by the neck, and an intense glow emanated from his body. Gradually, the cracks in her body disappeared, and she asked what he had done. The system provided information about Demon Shackle. It was a forced confinement item, usable on critically defeated monsters. He said this wasn't a coincidence. He could have saved the Demon Shackle for another occasion, but he had a personal interest. The system informed that after successful equipping, the corresponding monster would exit the critical state. A brilliant light shone. The rules indicated that the monster would obey the player who used the item as a familiar. Junseo commented that he had seen many players with familiars before, but this was the first time he had seen something like this, where the familiar was also a player. A notification appeared, informing that a contract had to be created with the ancient vampire Elizabeth Bathory. At that moment, a powerful beam of light rose before him, and the system notified the contract's creation. He shielded his eyes with his hand for protection, and on the panel, it was written that the ancient vampire Elizabeth Bathory was now registered as the familiar of player Shin Junseo. Looking at her in surprise, he said that although he expected changes in her appearance, that was a bit unexpected. Elizabeth looked at her own body and was shocked because she had transformed into a cat. He commented that it was unexpected for her to be a cat and not a bat, and even her collar had changed size. During that time, she paid no attention to what he was saying and continued staring at her body in horror. Soon, she managed to focus her strength, and an intense glow of mana made her return to her human form. Elizabeth said he shouldn't play around like that. She indignantly asked if he had really turned her into a familiar. Showing her teeth and trying to remove the shackles, she stated that she would rather die than suffer such humiliation. The protagonist asked if even maintaining a human form was difficult for her. He regretted it, but it seemed she had no choice but to accept the situation. The system notified that if there was normal or contaminated mana in reserve, the familiar's ability lock could be temporarily deactivated. And the protagonist commented that she was a familiar who couldn't even perform a simple transformation and wondered why he would need her. Elizabeth transformed back into a cat and displeased, said that as long as she was under his control, they needed to move forward. He picked her up in his arms, and she started swinging her paws and hissing. Junseo was surprised that she could still talk in this form, unsure if that was good or bad. He commented that it had nothing to do with what they were discussing but asked if she had really been deceived. Elizabeth replied that she had already told him everything. He placed her on the ground and said she didn't need to repeat it because he had heard everything clearly. However, while listening, he realized that some things contradicted each other. He asked if she had said that those people stole her powers to survive. But then, what was the purpose of such a life? He didn't know what had happened, but her family didn't seem very refined. He wasn't even sure if they possessed rational thought or ego. They seemed more like programmed dolls than living beings. Elizabeth replied irritably that this wasn't strange. People's psyches adapt to their physical bodies. They ended up in that state because they were forcibly using contaminated mana. It was obvious that this would result in ego atrophy. Did he really expect her to sympathize with those fools? Junseo responded that this wasn't what he meant. He was just saying that he or most people wouldn't continue living that way. With that, he approached a male doll and examined the body. If this person had switched bodies, then that was it. But as he observed the doll, he started to look surprised, and Elizabeth watched him attentively. She asked what was wrong with him, questioning why he was bringing this up now. The protagonist positioned himself in front of the large doll and said he was going to examine it. With an org in one hand, he pulled Elizabeth with the other, ordering her to come to him. Elizabeth flew toward him reluctantly, thinking it was terrible to be forced to obey such simple orders. Junseo commented that neither he nor she knew, but that was called an essence crystal. It was usually used in spells related to dark magic, saving mana and soul energy. He said that they had probably implanted something like that into the doll to give it a soul. Apparently, they didn't have enough power, but they were very technically skilled. Elizabeth became furious when he brought the org close to her and asked what he was saying, but then she was surprised and asked if there was no other way. Suddenly, she found herself in a room in the mansion and stood up for the first time. The whole family was seated in the living room. The woman said that in the past few days she had seen several hundred, maybe even thousands of visions, but the result was always the same: the collision of worlds in recent years. The frequency would increase uncontrollably, even if they tried to delay it as much as possible. In 5 years, it would be too late to prepare for it. Beth realized that this wasn't really happening. It must have been a vision based on memories. Were these her father's memories? The man excitedly asked what he meant by that. The hypothesis of different dimensions, something she had studied so that at least her family could survive. The mother replied that if Beth helped them, they could enclose the land around the mansion. But there would be problems. If their world was destroyed, the mansion would be lost forever between two worlds. Only if someone from another world found them could this last for hundreds or even thousands of years. Perhaps it would take even longer, and they would simply wait to die slowly. The father covered his face with his hand, disappointed, and said it was terrible. Then Rubus said that this wouldn't happen to Beth. His mother asked what he was talking about, and the boy asked how she thought they could live for a few more years. Rubus cried, saying that Beth's sister wasn't like that. Couldn't they at least save her? Their family was alive only because of what Beth did at that moment. If this was a fate they couldn't change, he thought that at least one member of his family should survive, but Beth would never accept being bound by string. When her body was already wrapped in threads, she asked with tears in her eyes why. Why did they do this? Because she trusted them. They looked at her with regret and cried, apologizing, truly regretting what had happened. At that moment, she transformed into a doll, and the woman took the sphere. She asked if, even after transferring their consciousness into the doll bodies, they would remain aware. Everyone held the spheres containing their souls, and the man said they would retain their consciousness for several dozen or even hundreds of years. But after that, their minds would gradually fade. In 2,000 years, they probably wouldn't even remember who they were, but they would still be dolls. They needed to do this even if their dimension was isolated because they didn't know what dangers and cruel monsters might threaten them. Once they became large dolls, they could protect Beth from the dangers. They didn't know how long it would take, but they would do it until someone from another world came and took her away. The protagonist looked at the system panel, which indicated that he had used 50 units of contaminated mana and temporarily unlocked the abilities of the familiar Elizabeth Bathory. Tears fell to the ground as Beth sat down, crying, asking why. Why didn't they tell her? But Junseo didn't let her finish and said on his own that if they had told her, they would have died together. It was inevitable, and she would have chosen to die with them. Then he walked past her and told her to get up because they didn't have much time. She didn't understand why he was in such a hurry, and the system panel indicated that Elizabeth's abilities as a familiar had been unlocked. He said it wasn't a full recovery, but it was still quite a lot. 50 units of contaminated mana gave only 3 minutes, and he hadn't paid that much just to see her crying. He thought she should at least draw some conclusions. They had been dolls all this time just to protect her. In the end, she should help put their spirits at ease. She screamed that she couldn't do that, but the protagonist didn't listen and sternly told her not to be so weak, because their destruction and death had been predestined. They could have simply decided to live out their last days happily, but they chose otherwise. They imprisoned themselves for life for the sake of her future, something they weren't even sure was real. It wasn't for Beth or for Junseo, but it was the least she could do out of loyalty to them. It was her minimum duty. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as she listened, then stood up with deep pain in her eyes. She looked at the mutilated dolls, and in her memories she still saw a happy family. She gathered all her regret and used mana to create a flame, standing beside the dolls as they burned in a wall of mana-infused fire. The system notified that Junseo had achieved an additional objective. He had discovered the truth about Elizabeth. As a reward, he received a mischievous treasure box. Elizabeth couldn't stop crying as she looked at the fire while the protagonist received additional rewards. Soon, they left the dungeon, where doctors were waiting for them. All the fighters were injured and walking with difficulty, supported by the medics. Only Junseo was alone, sighing, saying that it felt like he had been there longer than he thought. However, he felt uncomfortable saying that in front of Elizabeth and asked how she compared that world to hers. She replied that she didn't even want to compare. In Junseo's world, not even the mana was strong. However, there was no choice. No matter what kind of place it was, she would try to live a wonderful life there. That was her duty. It was already nighttime when Yurin arrived home, sighing with frustration and declared that she couldn't stop drinking because of this. Besides, today had been a terrible day for her. She looked ahead in displeasure because she noticed the shadow of a person in her kitchen and asked what that rat was doing there. Had he come to ruin everything completely? She turned on the light, and the young man asked why she called him a rat. That was very rude. He had been waiting for a colleague and had served himself some wine. Suffering from the long wait, she understood. Yurin extended her hand, filled with mana, and ordered him to stop talking nonsense and say the reason for his presence. If he wanted to pay for the bottle he had opened, even his life wouldn't be enough. The executor said that she was too rude, and of course he wasn't there for personal matters. He had heard that she had gone to an unranked dungeon. He knew that, and he was very interested in unranked dungeons. Rumors said it was a lot of fun there. After that, Yurin told him something. The executor replied that she had seen nothing. That was incredible. Who would have thought that she, a proud and haughty queen, would faint in the middle of a cleanup? Annoyed, she told him to shut up because the situation had changed drastically, and although she had been unconscious, she saw the results of what had happened with her own eyes. Taehyun killed the boss with just 2 sword strikes using the weapon the support had given him. Even considering the berserker explosion, this was an unprecedented amount of mana. He clenched his fist and said that everything was clear now, so S ranks were different, which meant that he was definitely worth hunting. But Yurin said she wasn't sure about that. Taehyun was very memorable, but she thought they should focus on the support. The executor looked at her with displeasure and didn't understand, so she said that she also thought he was just a D-rank pawn. She believed that all he could do was create weapons, but that weapon could withstand Taehyun's full power if the executor also wielded a sword. He replied that of course it was useful to know how to create a good sword. It wouldn't be bad to have someone like that by his side, but still, a tool is just a tool. If there's no one to hold the hilt, the weapon itself is useless. Their abilities were on opposite sides of the sword and the purity of battle. The rest was just impurity. Yurin said that if he were to hunt Taehyun, that impurity would be the main reason for his defeat, but he was already leaving, waving his hand and saying, yes, a D-rank support that the queen is obsessed with. Although not as much as Taehyun, he was now interested. Well, they would meet again. By the way, he could kill both Taehyun and the impurity. A few days later, Junseo was lying in bed, exhausted. He had slept for several days straight, but his condition still hadn't returned to normal. Actually, it wasn't because of creating the demonic weapon. He thought it was due to Beta's absorption abilities. He decided to ask just to be sure if there was any way to get rid of the side effects of his ability, but no one answered him. He started looking around the room and asked where she had disappeared to. He looked out the window and then got up with difficulty, stretching his body. All right, everything will be fine. She's his familiar. He can forcibly summon her. Beth knows that very well too. She must be interested in this new world until she starts acting strangely. At that moment, she was walking down the street, not allowing passersby to pet her. On Junseo's desk was a mischievous treasure chest. He couldn't believe he was seeing that chest in real life because it was a mischievous treasure chest. It was a random reward that players frequently found. Although the chest released a random item, it wasn't 100% random. The item in the mischievous chest was limited to what the owner needed. The problem was that this mechanism had some flaws. For example, one could obtain a sharp and heavy sword that could only attack but not block attacks. A shield might drop that could withstand any blow without recoil but randomly reflect the hit onto someone else. Regardless of the small flaws, the issue with these items was that they could be used. There were many cases of people trying to use items that somehow dealt with their flaws, but in the end, blood was still spilled. If the chest contained the item he wanted, then there could only be one thing inside, something that could restore mana or increase it by a certain amount. The type of item that could be there was determined. He opened the chest, and a bright light shone. The system informed that the wicked treasure chest had been opened. A dazzling light filled the room. It was important for him to know what weakness this item would have. The system informed that the mischievous treasure chest was selecting an item for the player, Shin Junseo. A bright flash appeared in his apartment, darkening even the sky, but it soon disappeared. In his hand was a ring. This was the Trader's Gluttony, which allows the owner to use the mana absorption ability. He questioned what that was. The system informed that the mana leakage function is proportional to the target's positive attitude toward the owner. The protagonist threw the ring against the wall in frustration and shouted that it was pissing him off. And at that moment, Beth arrived home. However, the protagonist declared that mana absorption was a powerful skill, but it depended on his relationship with the target, and from the very beginning, he knew that was something strange. Beth said she didn't know why Junseo was angry, but it seemed they had a guest outside. That idiot had arrived. He looked at the street, surprised, and asked who she was talking about. A luxury car was parked under the window. Isekai stepped out of it and asked what was wrong with that place. He declared that he couldn't believe Yun had placed his support to live in a place like that. Junseo looked at him, confused, and confirmed that it really was that idiot. Isekai took a closer look at his house and thought, although it's not ideal for him to personally want to recruit a support, he is worthy of it. Even without what Yuran told me, I can feel what happened. Shin Junseo did something to Taehan, and the energy that emanated from him would have been enough to break the barrier and reach him instantly. I don't know why this guy is ranked D, but he definitely has the potential to be at least rank A if not higher. So Taehan didn't fully understand him. If he doesn't completely belong to Taehan, no, even if he does, I will make this happen. The protagonist asked how he got his address. No matter what options he had, there was no way he had obtained it legally. Aok declared that it depended on how he looked at it. Normally, many would be astonished, thinking that they desperately wanted to be recruited into the best guild, and he asked if Junseo understood. He extended his hand. Junseo should have been impressed enough to personally come out and greet him. But Junseo walked past him and said that he was excused, but he wouldn't go out to greet him. Today he needed to renew his assistant work permit. He turned his back to Aok, who shouted that he would triple the payment. Whatever that bastard Taehan had promised him, he would give 3 times more. Aok was getting frustrated. Yes, he knew that after what Junseo did in the dungeon, he should see him as a terrifying person. But he would treat those with such power accordingly. He would create conditions for him that couldn't be compared to anything else, no matter where he went. The protagonist turned around and said he was surprised by such confidence, but that wouldn't change his answer. He would respond the same way he did to Taehan. They had nothing to offer him. Aok gritted his teeth and shouted that this was terrible. Besides, Kang Yuran had done the same thing yesterday. Yuran declared that all of them acted so unreachable that it was awful, saying that he, Aok, and the Shinwa Guild were just fools to them. Aok watched Junseo's back as he walked away and muttered that he and Yuran, he would make both of them beg to work for him. There were ordinary passersby and a peaceful city surrounding Junseo. He had planned to do this earlier, but the Hunter Association said that getting there by public transport was quite troublesome. Most hunters drove, so it made sense. He bumped into a passerby and apologized, and the man just nodded. The protagonist thought that he still hadn't fully recovered. The man passed by him and suddenly remembered something. He immediately turned around. That face, it couldn't be, but maybe it was. However, the protagonist didn't see anyone else on the street and expressed surprise upon realizing that Doyun was alive. The man observed his confused state and called his name. A portal appeared between the tall, enclosed buildings. The man said that if preparations were complete, then it was time to go. In C rank and higher portals, even high-level hunters could suffer or die from a single mistake. They should know that, but when it comes to safety, nothing is excessive. The mage said she was worried because it was her first time in a C rank and higher portal. Junseo was surprised by this and said that Tank was a veteran. If they listened to him, there wouldn't be any major problems, although it wasn't his responsibility as an assistant to ensure that. They went together with the girl to the portal. She said that Junseo seemed experienced enough to her. Dojin observed them, dissatisfied with him. Shin Junseo, a D-rank support specializing in creation. At that moment, the protagonist had already been questioned about his girlfriend, but he felt embarrassed. Dojin knew that he had been a hunter for 2 years, but only had 1 year of practical experience. At the beginning of that year, there was the Dawn Guild, with members who radiated positive energy. It was his brother Moon Doyun's guild. Before past events, he and his brother were eating, and Dojin asked what kind of D-rank portal that was. Why was he aiming for a D-rank portal? Given his guild standards, shouldn't he be aiming for a C rank or even higher? Doyun replied that even though it was D rank, the level was very high, and there were many resources there. In such dungeons, the benefits were incredible compared to the effort required. That was why large guilds frequently used them. Dojin said, dissatisfied, that it was too cheap. Even though guilds had a lot of money, D-rank portals were nothing more than pocket change for a large guild. Doyun replied that it was true, but not for a new guild like theirs. They could gain a lot even if they only took half of what they expected. They could strengthen the weapons of the guild's most diligent members, and also train with exclusive equipment, not gear from other guilds. He assured Dojin that time was running out. He just needed to wait. Soon, the whole world would know about the Dawn Guild. Dojin remembered his brother's radiant smile, but his dream did not come true. One day, he received a call and was asked if he was Dojin. He heard the unbelievable news from the association and immediately went to them. Indignant, he said that it didn't make sense. His brother was at B rank, a recognized veteran. He couldn't have died in a dungeon like that. However, the worker replied that it was an unusual dungeon. He didn't know what Dojin knew, but his brother had been in a dungeon of inestimable value. The subsequent investigation revealed that it was a high-risk place. Doyun was shocked to hear about the unconfirmed dungeon, and then he felt that his brother's death wasn't a simple accident. He said he had obtained that portal through an official auction and showed the document. He didn't know about the others, but Do-yoon wouldn't lie to him. The worker asked if Do-yoon's brother had told him anything. He thought for a moment, but why? No, who was responsible for that auction? He realized that something was wrong and answered anxiously that his brother hadn't told him anything. He believed that something had happened that defied common sense. The worker said that his brother's body would be delivered in 2 days after the investigation was completed and that they were lucky to have found his body. There was a survivor thanks to whom they were able to collect the corpses. Dojin was confused, and the guy confirmed that he didn't know the exact circumstances, but it seemed like he had just been lucky. The team was preparing to enter the portal. The team leader said it was time to start and enter the portal, declaring with a smile to finish the raid without serious injuries if possible. They began to enter the portal, and Dojin watched them. He couldn't believe that all the hunters had died, yet a D-rank support had survived by mere luck. No matter how much he thought about it, if the support was involved in his brother's death, he needed to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The worker guarding the portal tensed up, extended his hand, and blocked the man's path. He ordered him to stay put since those hunters were participating in the dungeon cleanup. But the man confidently showed his pass and said he was a member of the team. He had just arrived late, and also asked to see the guard's pass. Besides, what kind of idiot would come fully armed if he had nothing to do with the dungeon? The guard let him pass, and the referee laughed, saying he was lucky. And the guard asked again about the strange phrase, but the man replied that he was just happy to be able to enter. When he was far enough away, he said that everyone was lucky because if he hadn't made it, they would all die. He approached the portal and asked if the victim's name was Moon Dojin. Now he would see the abilities of his candidate for hero. Inside the dungeon there was a long, dark corridor with human remains scattered everywhere. At that moment, the team leader had already defeated a massive monster with a hammer. The system informed that it was a headless duke of B-rank danger level. He was exhausted and panting, saying that they had really managed to defeat the monster on their own. Dojin, shocked, looked at the monster, thinking that something was wrong. This couldn't be. It was just a C-rank dungeon. He declared that even if there was an identification error, it should be B-rank at most, and stated that if it had hidden its abilities until the end, it would be dangerous. The team leader said that their victory was possible thanks to Dojin. He never imagined they would have someone so talented with them. Dojin replied that it wasn't quite like that. Despite having helped, his contribution wasn't even half. He furrowed his brow and looked at his weapon, remembering that just a moment ago, the monster was still alive. All the team members were severely injured, and he also started to worry. This is bad. If he had brought his usual equipment, it would have been much easier for him. He was surprised when Junseo asked if he needed a new weapon. He extended his hand and said that he could make one for him in case he forgot about his abilities after leaving the dungeon. Dojin was nervous. Such strength, cutting power, and weight. Its characteristics were several steps ahead of his usual weapon. His hand started trembling. He couldn't believe that a guy capable of creating something like that instantly was only a D-rank support. After the battle, he called Shin Junseo and asked who he was. The protagonist replied that he thought the guy could ask himself that question in question when they had met. He didn't know his name and had never told him his own. Dojin admitted that was true, so he would rephrase the question. He took off his mask and asked if Junseo knew his brother. He was his older brother, the leader of the Dawn Guild. He had been a member of that guild for a year. To be honest, he didn't care who Junseo was. He just wanted him to say what had happened to his brother a year ago. He didn't know if Junseo was involved or not, but before he could finish speaking, the protagonist also tensed up as multiple fire attacks from the monster were coming their way. Dojin looked worried and then blocked the strike with his daggers, illuminating the area with a flash. He slid across the ground with sparks flying, thinking in fear about what was happening. Was there still a living monster? The executioner stepped forward toward them and said this was an unexpected development. Although the rising star Dojin, whose best days were still ahead, was capable of handling this, he didn't think anyone else could have avoided his strike. At that moment, he looked at the rest of the team, who were dead and covered in blood. Only the protagonist had protected himself with a shield. The executioner hadn't even considered that anyone else might have survived. Junseo furrowed his brows, and Dojin began to panic. He didn't know where that bastard had come from, but he was strong. Immediately he threw daggers at him, but he still didn't understand. Was he a berserker? Either way, this guy was talented, even better than Dojin. The executioner smiled and said they didn't need to be so afraid. They should just relax. He saw the protagonist putting away his shield and was surprised. Hearing that there was a D-rank support, was he the impurity? He questioned. The protagonist didn't understand what was going on, and the executioner said that was a real shame. He needed this guy to defeat Yoon Tahan, but that didn't mean he could just let Dojin live. And at that moment, the man prepared his daggers and thought about how he knew Junseo. but the executioner had already prepared a massive sword infused with dark mana. He decided to test if there was really something special about him. This hunt was about to get more interesting. Dojin was ready to face the attack. When the strike came, he jumped back amidst the flash and explosion. He realized that the executioner had incredible strength. He could only hold out against him 1 or 2 more times at most. If he was hit by one of his attacks, everything would be over in a single blow. The executioner swung his sword again. A spray of blood flew from the blade as Dojin dodged and began running forward. If this was already happening, he needed to evade the attack and find a weak point, no matter what. The executioner swung his sword once more, sending a bloody slash toward Dojin, but the boy managed to dodge and soon dissipate the attack. He said in disgust that this was annoying. It seemed like the second boy was useless. This couldn't even be called a 2-on-1 fight. Junseo said he was right. After that, the executioner suddenly felt pain. His hands were wrapped in mana threads. The same happened to his weapons. Beth appeared beside him, grinning as he remained trapped. She and Junseo declared that it was actually 3 against 1. A system window appeared, indicating that at that moment, he had no accumulated contaminated mana, so a penalty would be applied, reducing his mana. Blood began dripping onto the ground, and the system added that the summoning of the familiar Elizabeth Bathory would be forcibly terminated in 10 seconds. The protagonist coughed up blood, realizing that the mana he had obtained in a dangerous place wouldn't last much longer. Meanwhile, the executioner, restrained by the threads, turned to Elizabeth with displeasure while tearing them apart, and she watched him intently. The protagonist knew that the time he had left was enough to put an end to this furious battle. As soon as the executioner freed himself, he shouted that Beth was a foolish idiot and swung his sword, attacking with a blade of mana and fire. However, she barely moved. She just laughed at him because she had the missed ability. The executioner smirked, and Beth said it was a shame, but physical attacks alone didn't scare her. She remembered Tahan. Although they seemed similar, there was a slight difference in their levels. However, she was certain that the main difference lay in the weapons. Either way, it seemed like a farewell. While the executor was distracted by her, Dojin was already running backward, preparing mana and daggers. The boy tried to dodge and strike him with his sword, but Dojin left an illusion behind, getting very close to the executor. In an instant, his dagger became incredibly long and sharp. He swung it, and the executor looked at the blood in horror. The system informed that the summoning of Elizabeth Bathory's familiar had been completed. She began to evaporate and said that this wasn't so bad either, though the ending felt a bit unfinished. Then she saw the executor looking at her with displeasure. One of his hands had been severed. Dojin stayed close, still nervous, thinking that although the executor was difficult to kill, at least he could be seriously wounded. However, there was a significant gap in their basic abilities, and only in the current state did he have a chance. He said that if the boy wanted to live, he should drop his weapon and surrender because, considering his actions, the result would be the same. The executor listened with disgust and anger. He threw his sword to the ground, even though it meant submitting to the enemy. But Dojin soon realized that the man wasn't so simple. He had another plan. The executor placed the hand that had held the sword into his pocket and then pulled out a shining stone. Junseo was surprised to realize that he had charged mana into it, and the executor had already shattered the stone into many fragments. An intense light surrounded him, and a magic circle appeared beneath his feet. Dojin tried to attack and leaped at him with his daggers. The executor said that they would see each other later, and at that moment, Dojin struck the ground, creating a massive flash and a beam. He said, disheartened, that this was bad. That magic circle was for teleportation. The protagonist said that, on the contrary, it was good that it was only an escape item. If it had been an attack or debuff item, regardless of the outcome, Dojin wouldn't have made it out unscathed. He turned around, surprised, but the protagonist interrupted him, saying he would tell him about that day. He would tell him what happened a year ago with the Doan Guild and his older brother. He had the right to know. They exited the portal, and the workers carried the bodies, watching them. Dojin said sadly that he still felt terrible. Those people had been killed by that bastard. They had to lie and say they were killed by monsters in the dungeon, but Junseo said there was no other choice. According to the security team, they believed there were 7 in the team, and a few minutes after they entered, someone with an access card arrived late at the gate. Dojin said that couldn't be, and Junseo confirmed it. However, the unthinkable had happened. The certificate was good enough to deceive security. No, maybe it was an actual pass. The protagonist remembered his excited team and Doyun showing the certificate, just as he had said before. The same thing had happened a year ago when an unregulated dungeon was openly auctioned and certified. He didn't know their purpose, but it definitely wasn't something a small group could pull off. 2 documents were issued, the access permit and the proof of the auction agreement. If the association got caught, any organization involved would disappear. An important person hadn't been caught even after deceiving the association. No, perhaps it was someone so influential that even if they were caught, nothing would change. Junseo was sure. He also had a general understanding that the scoundrels they were dealing with weren't ordinary people, so they lied to the families of the guild members, including his own. There might be someone among them who couldn't accept that. Dojin commented that if they officially reported this to the association, those people might suffer, just as he had said. Dojin understood everything. Now he was going to ask about Junseo's ability. He realized that it made no sense for him to be a D-class creator. Why was he hiding it? The protagonist replied that it would be a long story, but before what happened a year ago, his ability was useless. He could only create 1 or 2 swords. It was so bad that he was ashamed even to be called D-class. However, a year ago, in an unregulated dungeon, he awakened a new ability while he was dying. Thanks to that, he was the only survivor. Of course, that sounded unreal. He understood. It might seem suspicious. If he were Dojin, he wouldn't believe it either. But when the main culprit and the secret behind it all were revealed, he planned to tell the world and their families. However, he justified the fact that he had hidden the truth by bowing and asking for forgiveness. Dojin stepped back, shocked, and the protagonist said that one day he would definitely find those responsible for Doyun's death. Dojin heard him and asked, would he really find them? The protagonist replied that he shouldn't act as if this was only his problem, without excluding the fact that he was also responsible for all of this. He couldn't provide answers to any questions. Now he was no different from Junseo. Even after seeing everything with his own eyes, he should remain silent before those who had the right to hear the truth, and he wouldn't stop until those responsible for his brother's death paid for it. He would get them at any cost, and until then, he was in Shin Junseo's hands. From now on, they could only count on each other. At that moment, in the abandoned building, the executioner appeared within the magic circle. As soon as the glow faded, he couldn't stand for long and collapsed onto his knees. The executioner said they were repulsive. His face was tense with disgust. The priestess said she didn't know who he was talking to, but she understood that he was saying this after losing and running away. Wasn't this a scene that bothered him? She mocked him, calling it a nightmare. It would have been better if he had returned dead, or at least in a desperate state. Then she could have sacrificed him. The executioner wanted to protest, but the priestess refused to listen to him. She told him not to act like that. She still expected a lot from him, even though she didn't know why. The man was startled when something glowing approached him. He looked at the unsettling substance and asked what it was. The priestess told him not to reject it, but to eat it, as this creature would become his new arm. The executioner started backing away, telling the creature not to come near him and questioning if she really thought he would take that unknown thing and swallow it. The priestess said she understood everything. They didn't have a relationship of trust, but under these circumstances, there was no choice. Even if it wasn't his main arm, losing any limb would be bad. She didn't know since she didn't use a sword, but how would he handle this with only his own efforts? The executioner took the disgusting creature in his palm, saying that suddenly, something was about to happen. She replied that yes, he could do whatever he wanted, if he could. The executioner swallowed the creature and immediately felt excruciating pain. He screamed loudly, his body trembling. The priestess, indifferent, said that was incredible. It seemed that the two of them were much more compatible than she had imagined. She thought this process would take all night, yet this was only the primary form. The veins in his hand glowed with contaminated mana. After some time in use, the creature would automatically determine a more suitable form. If he didn't like it, he could tell her. That creature was like a child to her, so he could do whatever he wanted with it. The executioner clenched his teeth in fury and decided he would kill them all. That irritating girl Moon Dojin and the boy who had cut off his hand. He especially remembered Junseo with rage, vowing that he would kill him too. A special flight arrived at the airport. A crowd had gathered at the entrance. A girl commented that it must be a celebrity arriving and suggested that he look at all those reporters and cameras. He replied that it was a hunter and declared that they were from the Himu Guild. She said she had never heard of them, but wanted to know why they were arriving through the airport. The guy said he was reading articles about it. Apparently, they had been invited to the United Kingdom because it must have been a highly dangerous and difficult portal. The reporters shouted that they were entering the airport. They asked Wu Kane how she felt after clearing the city at dawn. They had heard that she had received an incredible sum from the British government. Her assistant tried to shield Wu Kane from the reporters. They asked if she thought the country's top 3 guilds could compete internationally. The assistant said they wouldn't be giving interviews at that moment, and that they would answer questions later at the official press conference. As they were leaving, the girl commented that the guild leader had done a good job. The day had ended, and the day after tomorrow, they would have a press conference with the representatives of the Sana Guild at 11 a.m. By the way, 2 days ago, there were traces of the executioner. She was surprised and asked where. The assistant replied that 2 days ago, in the erroneous dungeon in Bupyeon. According to witnesses and the statement of the person responsible for the perimeter, someone appeared later than the others, and their characteristics matched the descriptions in the reports about the executioner. According to the association, there were 2 survivors. Wu Haiyan looked at the basic information about the user's abilities on the tablet. There was the registration number, the name Shin Junseo, and his position as a support. The assistant commented that the survivors were a B-class assassin and the second a D-class support. Wu Haiyan asked if there were any survivors and a D-class support. She then questioned how a D-class support managed to survive after the executor. She asked if the B-rank assassin's skills were good, but the woman stated that she didn't know. Although both had claimed that the deaths of their companions were an accident that could have happened during a hunt, Wu Haiyan wondered why. There weren't many possible explanations. They could have been on the executor's side or had been threatened in various ways to stay alive. She asked to add this to her agenda. She wanted to meet with both of them. After all, she wanted to know what they could tell her. The protagonist was at home, sighing as he didn't think he would make it this far. And as expected, he found no information among the Greatsword users in the Hunter Association's records. There were 2 points. First, he was indeed an unofficial hunter. And second, he generally had a different appearance. The only thing he could be sure of was that he was connected to the extermination case that had occurred in the dungeons of the Ranking Era. Furthermore, the very existence of the dungeons from the Ranking Era could be the work of the organization he belonged to. Even in the mansion situation where Beth was, everyone could have been exterminated there, including Yoon Tae-hyun. He remembered Ayok's fighting style. Judging by their skill and potential, everyone there could become heroes in the future, regardless of their character. If they were eliminated, it would be a huge loss for the future world. He closed his laptop. The fact that they hadn't stopped falsifying dungeon rankings and sending assassins, but were doing so separately, indicated the possibility that the assassins were operating outside the dungeons, which meant the situation was dangerous. While reflecting, he received a call. He answered and was immediately shocked by the voice. They asked if he was Shin Junseo. Soon he found himself in a large, beautiful building. There, in an elegant bar, Kang Yuren was waiting for him. She said that when she chose the meeting place, she had expected cleaner clothes. Was she expecting too much from him? The protagonist replied that he had never been to places like that and didn't plan to. In any case, he had become increasingly suspicious lately. He didn't think his address and phone number were in the public database of the association. She asked why he was talking about the address. Had that fool Ayok gone after him? Now it was clear what had happened. He must have looked for him with an unpleasant smile and unfounded confidence. She seductively reached for his hand and told Junseo not to worry. She wouldn't say anything as heavy-handed as that fool. She invited him out of personal interest. Had he come because he was interested in her or for business, he should sit. She would pay for their drinks. The protagonist said that this wasn't a conversation that could be had freely over drinks. If she had nothing special to say, he would get straight to the point. Yoren said she was interested, but she didn't see what happened at the end of the last dungeon because she lost consciousness. She recalled Beth, who was cunning and strong, and asked how he had defeated that monster. Even Tae-hyun in his state wouldn't have stood a chance. He replied that she should ask Tae-hyun, not him. He was a D-class support with no combat abilities, and when she was unconscious, he couldn't do anything about the situation. He used all his remaining energy to create a sword. That was all he knew. Yoren smiled mischievously and said she understood everything. Okay, what else did he want to tell her? They talked a little about recent events, and then Yoren commented that although it was absurd, she found it funny. A sick little bastard with a greatsword roaming around hunting hunters. Could it be that she was the next victim of this man? The protagonist said that if his predictions were correct, the fact that they had entered a misclassified dungeon meant that she was their target. And among those whom entered, she was the only hunter who didn't belong to any guild. Yoren interrupted him, so they would attack her first, the only one without protection from an organization. That seemed plausible, but wasn't he forgetting something important? If they were talking about this, she wasn't the only one. There was also a D-class support. He wasn't part of any organization or guild, and his abilities were much weaker than hers. If what he was saying was true, wasn't he himself in danger? She made a tempting and playful offer. What did he think? If he wanted, she could protect him. But Junseo turned around, saying that he had already said everything he wanted to, and then turned to leave. However, he asked her to take his words seriously because her life was in danger. She watched his figure disappear into the distance, and then made a call. Yoren said that Junseo had just left. He should do his best. This was his chance to repay his debt. Meanwhile, she had a mischievous smile, thinking about what would happen. The protagonist was walking down a dark street completely alone when he suddenly stopped. The executioner asked if it wasn't strange to say that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. He didn't know anything but acknowledged Junseo's courage because he hadn't expected him to be walking alone at night just a few days later. The executioner looked at him with disdain and asked if Junseo was really an idiot. Irritated, he said bluntly that if he wanted to run or scream, it would all be useless. He was certain Junseo hadn't noticed, but he was already trapped. They were under Manadome, a skill called Dark Space. The executioner knew there was a priestess on a nearby rooftop and commented that the sorceress who had created the barrier was very talented. As long as the barrier existed, no one would know what was happening inside. Whether Junseo or the executioner died, no one would have a clue. The protagonist heard all of this and, indifferent, commented that it wasn't bad. The barrier didn't just block entry. Was the barrier based on the principle of creating a virtual space that imitated reality? Aside from the contaminated mana, he was a little concerned that he couldn't sense anyone's presence. He thought the executioner had killed all the people who lived there. That was a relief. Despite their abilities, his organization had a certain level of perception. The executioner didn't understand the kind of nonsense the protagonist was talking about. But the protagonist interrupted him again and asked if the executioner wanted to do anything else. In a way, he had already expected to be hunted and knew that this could happen that day. He recalled his conversation and farewell with Yurin, how she had said that he was the perfect person to be hunted. The executioner gritted his teeth in rage and asked, how could a mere support who couldn't do anything alone dare to say such things? He drew his sword and immediately swung it, creating a massive blade of fire. He shouted, asking how a useless support could talk so much while pretending to be righteous. The enormous and powerful blade flew toward the protagonist, but he didn't move. When the attack struck him, a great explosion of mana illuminated the space. After the blow, the executioner stared at him. Junseo stood before him, holding a massive sword that he had used to block the attack, glowing intensely with mana. He was shocked because this wasn't an attack like the previous one. Moreover, most people who had learned to fight would have already died. The protagonist put his sword away and said that this was the first time that year he could fight an enemy face to face without worrying about spectators. The battle with the ice monster was still fresh in his memory. The furious executioner began attacking, swinging his sword wildly. He asked, a support who isn't capable of doing anything alone. The protagonist replied that he wasn't entirely wrong, but it was better to see with his own eyes. His eyes shone intensely with mana, and he activated his skill Grid World. Meanwhile, a car arrived at the scene and Wu Haiyan stepped out. She looked around. Everything was calm and silent. She saw no signs or traces of the portal, but she could definitely feel the contaminated mana. Wu Haiyan was of the Saint class, a class considered above average among supports. They typically used both regular mana and a special divine energy. Divine power was considered the opposite of contaminated mana, so while some Saint classes couldn't see mana, they could sense it. Wu Haiyan's assistant asked if they should report this to the association since contaminated mana in the middle of a residential area was strange and dangerous. But Wu Haiyan replied that they wouldn't do that for now. She prepared her staff and started walking toward the barrier, saying that if she didn't return or make contact within 30 minutes, her assistant could report it to the association. She filled her staff with mana, and it glowed intensely as she walked toward the wall. The assistant watched everything, thinking that it looked like an ordinary wall, but the guild leader could sense something. Suddenly, she almost screamed in surprise when Wu Haiyan started walking directly into the wall, and soon the street became silent. The assistant couldn't believe it. She simply couldn't see the leader or sense her presence anywhere. She began to worry and said she hoped nothing serious would happen. Inside the barrier, an intense battle was raging, with flashes of mana and explosions. Junseo's strong and powerful blades flew to attack the executor, who managed to block the strikes. However, at times, he barely avoided the weapons flying at him from the sides and behind. He angrily said that Junseo was an idiot using ineffective tricks. Meanwhile, he dodged a grenade flying toward him, but when he turned back, he saw another grenade right behind him. The KM-38 grenade, used by the military against monsters, exploded. The protagonist watched the bright explosion and continued creating weapons, but the priestess was also observing him, trying to gauge how strong he was. If even the Empress bowed to him, he was certainly someone who could be a nuisance. There was nothing particularly admirable about the functionality of the weapons he created. They were just strong and sharp, but unfortunately, these qualities could only be demonstrated when wielding the weapons. They needed to be made with an emphasis on physical strength. She looked at Junseo, surrounded by several spears and swords. Unbelievable. The creator of these weapons didn't just throw them, he launched them with such precision that the executor could barely repel the attacks, frantically swinging his sword. The speed, angle, power, and accuracy of the weapons were so precise that even an experienced executor struggled. Additionally, he created firearms and knew how to use them at the right moment, in the right place. This wasn't just a good creator. Using abilities like that would be impossible if he didn't have real combat experience at a veteran level. And yet, such a monster still remained in the shadows. Amid a cloud of mana dust, the executor coughed. Meanwhile, Junseo declared that mana bullets weren't effective against monsters above C rank. However, he couldn't say the same about humans, since strength and durability were completely different, especially if the attack was from behind. He didn't even want to imagine it. The executor was completely covered in blood, barely able to stand. The protagonist said that he himself had been through this. Maybe the guy would give up, but covered in wounds, the executor frowned and bared his teeth, calling him a disgusting bastard. Then the protagonist said he had only asked out of politeness. At that moment, the executor turned and saw that, To the side in the sky, many daggers were pointed at him. He found himself in a terrible position, with swords rapidly descending on him from all directions. Junseo clenched his fist, and then all the swords fell onto the executor, creating a massive explosion with bright flashes. The protagonist shielded his hand from the wind and dust, but then looked on in surprise. There was still a figure of a man standing before him. The executor dropped his sword to the ground, and his hand began to deform, transforming into something horrifying. The priestess cast a spell on him, saying that she had to do it, even though she would rather not. She said with disdain that her colleague was in danger, so she should help him. If she had known this would happen, she would have gathered more information to prevent it. Maybe she was being too greedy, but well, he should try anyway. Now the executor's hand had transformed into a massive blade with a sharp tip. To protect himself, Junseo created an equally massive mana sword. He found it suspicious that the severed right hand was completely fine, but suddenly, contaminated mana of such a high level appeared. He hesitated but still began to attack. His sword flew rapidly toward the executor. However, the man swung his transformed hand, and the contaminated mana blade easily sliced through Junseo's sword, splitting it in two. The protagonist watched the blade approaching in shock, but managed to create a shield that absorbed the full impact of the attack. Soon, the shield vanished, and the priestess commented that this wouldn't be easy. Creating a strong weapon wouldn't be enough. While it seemed the protagonist really did possess skills, she was surprised to see him pull out a special item from his pocket. Hizu had given it to him when they met. It was a gift to remind him of the contract with the guild leader. She had heard that he was searching for useful items in Araken's territory. The protagonist looked at the gift in surprise. Inside the box was Araken's bloodstone. This stone contained Araken's final screams. When used, it could allow the user to temporarily acquire the same class and rank as the one who dealt Araken's fatal blow for 1 minute. The skills and rank would match the user's, but after the duration ended, they would lose 99% of their remaining stamina. He had never imagined he would use it, and as the executor prepared to attack, Junseo swallowed the stone. At that moment, the executor started running toward him, screaming, but his sounds couldn't form words, as if he were unconscious. Junseo remained still, waiting for the enemy to approach, and then extended his hand to the side. The executioner screamed and swung his hand with the blade, but the effect of the bloodstone had already been activated. The clash of their attacks caused mana fragments and a blinding flash. At that moment, the system notified that for the next minute, Shin Junseo's class and rank would be equal to Yoon Tae-han's. The tense and furious executioner was shocked. His attack had been blocked, and the protagonist remarked that now he knew what it was like to be part of a combat class. Both were struggling to contain their attacks, but the protagonist said they were moving on to the second round. His sword and body were engulfed in intense flames. He activated the explosion skill.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.